This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Budget and Performance Committee. It's an innovation that we're trying with outside experts coming in, commenting on our budget, and the bulk of the meeting today will be listening to their answers to our questions, and we'll be having a comfort break at about the halfway mark. But first, some quick housekeeping. So can I ask everyone to make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid interruptions? And can I ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies today from Assemblymember Rogers, Assemblymember Duval and Assemblymember Fortune and Assemblymember Desai, and Assemblymember Baker is here as a substitute.
Excellent. Okay, item 2 is declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Noted. Good. 3 is summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions from previous meetings of the committee?
Noted.
Noted. Excellent. And 4, Mayor's Budget 2024-25. This is our main item of business today. Discussion focusing on the Mayor's Budget for 2024-25 with a panel of external experts. So I'd like to welcome all of our guests here this afternoon. We have Alfie Stirling, who's the Chief Economist and Associate Director at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. We have Tom Pope, who is joining us remotely, Deputy Chief Economist at the Institute for Government. We have actually we do not quite yet have Professor Tony Travers, but we hear he is inbound, who is visiting professor at the LSE Department of Government and Director of LSE London. We also have here in the room Professor Jagjit Chadha, I do apologise, Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. We have Antonia Jennings, CEO of the Centre for London, and we have Stuart Hoggan, Associate Consultant, LG Futures. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as I say, we will have a brief interlude at the halfway point. But if I can lead off with the first question this afternoon, which is to all of the panellists, so I'll go in order from left to right just to keep things logical. What do you think the Mayor's top 3 priorities in London should be for 2024-25? So, Stuart.
Good afternoon. I think the first thing that strikes you about the budget setting process is how challenging the overall context is, both the international and macroeconomic situation, and also more specifically the point we're at in the political cycle, both for central government and for local government. And the second thing that strikes me when I look across the material that we were sent in advance is of course, how pressing the priorities are across all of the areas that the Mayor is responsible for. There's no easy options on any of the functional responsibilities. That said, the largest is of course transport, and that's critical to the functioning of the city and also its economic viability. So that one I think I would put as one of the 3. Policing I would put as the second one. There's enormous challenges there at the moment, both in terms of performance and in terms of culture. We've had the Casey report since the final budget was set last year, which I think is an enormously significant document for the service and one which I know and assume that they're taking very seriously in implementing. And I think if I had to add a third to that, I would add environmental considerations. As you said, Chair, we need to make sure we have time for that in the course of the afternoon. It's an issue in which the Mayor has been very prominent, and I think it will secure a great deal of support across the communities in the capital. So that's the 3 areas I would mention.
Thank you, Stuart. Antonia.
Great. Can you hear me?
We can.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to join you guys today. So I will just caveat what I'm about to say with the fact that I'm only a month into the role, so I'm not completely on top of all of Centre for London's policy positions, but I will give it my best shot. But having said that, I think what our research is showing at the moment is that, perhaps looking a bit into the longer term, as opposed to just the next 12 months, we know that the capital's main challenges are going to be both the roadmap to net zero and also addressing cost of living. What we also know is a lot of the solutions to both are really quite similar. So, of course, I'm talking about, for example, retrofit and the retrofit of both residential but also public buildings, both to alleviate cost of living crisis and also advance towards net zero, rollout of EV and also kind of expansion of micro mobility. So I think from our perspective, interventions that sit between retrofit and addressing the cost of the climate and the cost of living crises are the ones that we should be focusing on. And then on top of all of that, I think, as we all know, just housing remains an absolute priority. And I think at Centre for London, something that we've done a fair amount of work on is kind of showing that the housing crisis can actually be seen as the baseline from which a lot of other crises in London stem. So housing, of course, in and of itself is a human right, but I don't think it's too much of a jump whatsoever to link housing to, for example, the skills crisis we're facing, productivity, climate, as I've mentioned, etc. So climate, cost of living and housing would be the three that I'd pick. Thank you.
We now move to the part where I'm reminded that I forgot to switch my microphone back on, followed by Jagged. What should the Mayor's three priorities be?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for inviting the National Institute of Economic and Social Research to contribute to this very important new innovation, it seems to be, in your budget process, to have impartial experts come along and interact with this process at what is a very difficult time for the country, and also in London in some sense, strikes me as an incredibly valuable thing to have brought about. So may I first congratulate you on that step. I in a way prefer to talk about the context, which we've already heard from Stuart and Antonia. These are difficult circumstances in the national and international economy. Growth is sluggish, stuttering. You put some numbers to me from our colleagues at the OECD, which actually look a little bit optimistic compared to our view in terms of GDP and inflation and unemployment. So you take their numbers and take a slightly worse number in every case, and you'll get an idea of where we sit at the National Institute. And all of that, all of that is behind. What is behind a lot of that as well is that is also being represented in what we're seeing as an increasing level of income inequality, a rise in destitution, and a rise in the number of families who can't afford their day-to-day bills. We've already heard about that in the context of the cost of living crisis. But that all said, when we look at the aggregate picture for London as opposed to the rest of the country, it still does very well. It's gross value added, its GVA we project to be some 5% above the pre-COVID level. That's our reference point for our analysis at the Institute. It's been so noisy, 21, 22, 23. We'd like to go back to the end of 2019 and draw a comparison. And London is, in that sense, far and away above every other part of this country. It's done very well. Real wages, on average, which of course is masking a huge degree of heterogeneity at the household level, are also likely to grow by some 7% compared to falls in other parts of the country. The gross level of value added in London is twice the average that we see in the rest of the country. So what does that then mean in terms of the Mayor's priorities? It seems to me we're living through some difficult times, and yet London is still a leader for the country and is potentially a focal point for economic development of the country by and large. So there needs to be some courage there in terms of thinking about the priorities. It's not necessary to retrench, and it's not necessary to wring your hands and say we're in an awful situation, nothing can be done. Actually, compared to other parts of the country and many other parts of the world, London is still a healthy, thriving place with many opportunities available to it. So I would very much think about trying to act upon the constraints to growth that we can see, and that would mean the transport system, it would mean housing, rents, for example. The data we have goes back about 2006, is set to grow by some 6% this year, which is the highest in the sort of period that we're able to examine. So that suggests there's a housing problem that needs to be addressed. And in the middle of all of that, so many other problems can be helped if we have economic development in more deprived areas. So I would put that down as my third of the main priorities. Not at all.
Recurring theme. Thank you very much, Jagged. Appreciate those. We now welcome Professor Tony Travers. And the opening question, Tony, is what should the Mayor's top three priorities be for this coming 24-25 budget year?
Okay, well, first, apologies for being slightly late. I think I'm sure the I've heard just from Jagjit, and others will have mentioned these points, but let's go from here. I mean, I think overwhelmingly the Mayor's budget is, and this will be true of the budgets for the other bodies involved in the GLA, will have to deal with epic levels of uncertainty. So uncertainty, it seems to me, is a big challenge. So I'll come on to the three question, but I mean, just to frame the discussion, here we are after 13 and a half years of enormous pressure on local government budgets, subnational government budgets. There's an Institute for Government report out this morning on the impact that has had on the public services across the board, but it's worth remembering that local government, along with some other parts of the state, have actually taken disproportionately large reductions in their budgets. And of course, City Hall, in a sense, is a very different position to the boroughs, but the uncertainty and the impact on their spending patterns over this 13 to 14 year period is profound. And add to that, we have had, and it's a cliche, but let's do it one more time, 5 once-in-a-lifetime events in the last 15 years affecting all of us, the way people see the need for government, which I think has expanded. I mean, whatever your political view about how big government should be, I think the events of the last 15 years, from the banking crisis through to more recent events, lead to not only often the need for more government, but a change in people's attitudes to what government can do. So I think that's the second thing I'd say to frame all of this. But I just come back to the uncertainty question, because here we are, you are trying to assess a multi-billion-pound budget, gross and net, looking forward into a year that begins next April, against a backdrop of many local authorities, and realise the GLA is in a different category, having not finished, having audited accounts for 1, 2 or 3 years backwards. Now, there are reasons for that, which we could discuss on another occasion. So that adds even further, I think, to the uncertainty surrounding all subnational public finance, certainly in England. So to go to the three issues that I think inevitably come out of the scale of the bodies that the GLA is responsible for. I mean, one, the budget, the GLA budget, the gross budget, total budget, is enormously exposed to changes in TfL's financial position at any point. Second, the demands on the Metropolitan Police, which itself is going through a period of profound adjustment and change, and it in turn then depends on national government, as they all do, actually, all these bodies to some degree, central government's funding capacities, which are now themselves limited. So they've got the the TfL budget, the Metropolitan Police budget, and last but not least, the process is slightly made more difficult by the fact that we don't have brilliant data at the moment for where London's population or labour force are going, because the Office for National Statistics, for reasons you'd have to ask them about, has clearly found itself less able than normal to produce up-to-date figures for these things. I suspect Jagjit knows more about this than I do. So I think, so it's the big-ticket budget items that can profoundly affect the overall GLA budget, and uncertainty, I would say, trying to be flexible as well as predictive in a very uncertain environment.
Okay, thank you, Tony. That was very interesting. Now, our last in-the-room guest, we have Alfie. What would your sort of analysis and top three points or priorities be?
Sure, thank you very much.
Don't forget, there's a little picture on there with a person with something coming out of their mouth.
Doing your thing. Yeah,
perfect.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Thank you very much for having me here. I agree with a lot of what's been said, to be honest. I don't know if I want to just sort of talk for the sake of talking, but I think the point I'd emphasise is probably just, in terms of priorities, the centrality of the living standards crisis that we have at the moment. I think with the rate of inflation coming down, having come through the pandemic, seeing the economy on average at aggregate recovering pre-pandemic levels, it's tempting to think, well, actually the worst is behind us, perhaps, on this current living standards crisis. But I think there's a good chance that's an optimistic standing point. So inflation is still rising, far, far ahead of target. But also there are another two waves that are hitting people's finances. One is high interest rates, which themselves have a long lag effect in terms of affecting households. And for the very poorest households, yes, it is mortgages as well, actually. There are low-income households on mortgages that are really struggling. But it's also high numbers of unsecured lending. And as bank loans turn over, as people become increasingly exposed to their credit cards and overdrafts, that is something that is almost becoming the price of money itself is becoming a second hit to finances, even as inflation begins to fall. And the third wave, which I think unfortunately is a cause for pessimism, has been mentioned, is a weakening labour market as well. Again, actually through, deliberate in some senses. It's about an aggregate strategy to bring prices down by taking domestic heat out. But we are seeing the labour market weaken. We don't know, I don't think, quite how serious that could become in terms of uptick unemployment. We talk about uncertainty, which I think is an important thing to reflect on. But right now, policymakers in the UK are flying quite blind in terms of what's happening in the labour market. The surveys we rely upon are not working as they used to 3 or 4 years ago. We don't have the response rate. So we are flying quite blind. Unemployment has already upticked far ahead of where the bank was projecting. And I think that's a third cause for pessimism for why living standards could well be, if they haven't passed the peak, certainly could linger at very severe levels for quite some time now. Just two other remarks and then policy priorities. I think the other cause for concern is that many of the coping mechanisms that people have had in place to deal with this cost of living crisis pinch has been savings on the one hand, and then being able to take out loans and credit on the other. And I think we're increasingly seeing now that both of those coping mechanisms for many people are beginning to decay, both savings being spent down, people being credit constrained and unable to take out the loans, perhaps even more serious than the rising financial costs. And the data we're seeing in terms of the 6 monthly surveys we're seeing is that people are increasingly, especially on low incomes, seeing actually overall debt fall a bit, but they're having to go without essentials. So they're literally not they're skipping meals, they're not paying energy bills. And that again is something that could get worse. So three policy priorities. For me, number one has probably got to be the adequacy of cost of living support across all different dimensions that takes place. Obviously, there are national government policies, but there's lots that can be done combined authority at local authority level as well. The second is housing, and again, I think clearly again. Big stuff on planning or private market regulation. But I think for local authorities, thinking about the tenure mix are the things that can be done immediately to take advantage of the fact that lots of landlords on a buy-to-let mortgage are being pushed to a sell position. Is there something the local authority can do to help with the housing mix in response to that? And the third is probably supply-side employment measures. So the services we put in place to help people find a job, childcare, making sure that parents can release the hours to be able to work if they want to. So those would be my three priorities.
Thank you, Alfie. And then finally we have Tom, who's joining us online. Tom, what would your analysis and top three priorities be?
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I can't be joining you in person today. I'd also like to thank Tony for plugging our report, Institute for Government report, supported by SIPFA on public services, which was published this morning, and I think that does speak to several of the challenges facing London. I think I'd agree with much of what has already been said, but I'll try to say things that are perhaps a little bit different or with a slightly different focus. So on transport, which I think takes up the majority of the budget and as a result has to be a big priority, I do think a particular challenge there, if I could hone in on one thing, is the changing patterns of use, changing commuting patterns that are perhaps starting to settle down now after a COVID crisis and now a couple of years, or at least a year of recovery. And I think really working out what that means for TfL's financial model going forward, what element of cross-subsidy, if at all, beyond fair income is going to be needed to fund it, whether that means there need to be new approaches to TfL and fares, for example, I think is a really important challenge for this budget, and perhaps one that can wait one more year to see whether commuting patterns further return to their pre-COVID norm, but certainly not much longer than that. Then on police, again, another big chunk of the budget, and I think there's a combination of a set of challenges that they're facing policing across the country, and that includes the extra police officers and the challenge of sort of using them most appropriately across the country. There's been a big fall in charge rates across all kinds of crime in the past 5 years in particular, that hasn't yet started to reverse. And I think there's a challenge there about how new officers are being deployed, and a particular challenge in London, where I know this committee has already looked at challenges with the recruitment of extra officers in London, which has proved harder here than it has elsewhere. But then, of course, and perhaps relatedly, a set of specific issues for the police in London, particularly coming out of the Casey review. And I think that means that policing does understandably have to be a priority too. And the third point I'd make, if I may, I'd sort of step back a bit and sit at a slightly higher meta level, if you like. And I was reflecting in preparing for this just how many different strategies I could look at that defined priorities for London, whether that be the Met turnaround plan, the 2018 housing and environment strategies, the TfL business plan, the Mayor's priorities for each area, and the GLA missions. Of course, there's overlap between each of those, but it really is a very large array of different sort of high-level priorities for London. And then a set of often quite different metrics being used for the quarter-to-quarter, year-to-year performance management, whether that be in the quarterly performance metrics sitting across the 9 GLA missions, or the TfL scorecards, or the MOPAC quarterly performance indicators. And I do think there's a challenge that's all a bit muddled and there's a little bit too much. And I think for this budget to be really effective, and whatever priorities the Mayor settles on, for the budget really to deliver well against those, there's a case for streamlining the performance framework, if you like, to ensure there's a really clear link between what are the outcomes that the GLA and the Mayor are really targeting this year, what then are the respective inputs and outputs that you would want to see from the services more directly under control. And then also, I think, stated within that, where can the GLA not do everything? What is the role for the boroughs within delivering those priorities as well? And also, where is their reliance on central government? I think there's a space for more coherence to be brought on that question, to allow whichever priorities are settled on to be better sort of delivered within the financial framework.
Thank you, Tom. There was a knowing chuckle in the room. I don't think you picked it up when you mentioned the, what would be the polite way of putting it, the not always 100% overlap between the set of strategies and the set of targets and measurable metrics. So I think that's a point we very much would agree with. Thank you, everyone, for your sort of initial comments. First sort of specific question, really. I don't know who has a thought on this. We can indicate if you wish to have a go at answering. So the Mayor's allocated funds to various reserve pots that are not allocated, and there's no clear guidelines on how he would wish to use them. Specifically, for example, there's the Transport Services Funding Reserve, which has £100 million in it, and the Environmental Improvement Fund of 134 million, roughly. How would you propose that he should be spending that money? So as far as we know, it's unallocated. If he's allocated it, he hasn't told us. So what ought we to be suggesting that he could spend the 100 million Transport Services Funding Reserve or the 134 million Environmental Improvement Fund? Anybody have any shopping lists that they've brought with them? Stuart.
So can I be more controversial and enter a note of caution on this?
Please do.
My current role is an associate consultant with LG Futures, one of the leading local government finance consultancies. But previously, I worked in central government and led the annual settlement process for 7 years, I think, which is giving the Mayor the money to spend. And also, I was in charge of the programme of finance reform, which was, the ideas on business rates retention and fair funding and so forth. And I think what I would observe is that the budget that we're thinking about this year will be the 6th annual budget that local authorities have experienced, which is pretty poor, really, isn't it? And we understand why. Combinations of political turbulence and COVID have led to short-sightedness in central government. But the outcome of that for local authorities is a lack of any forward horizon to plan. And the inevitable consequence of that uncertainty is authorities become more cautious in maintaining reserves. And there's two other factors that I'd mention as well. Throughout that period, government has promised fundamental reform of the finance system and has yet to deliver that. And you know, many of the same reasons apply. But again, it leads to a position of caution on the part of authorities, needing to hold reserves in case there is a business rates reset, for example, and that works in an adverse way. And of course, the final factor is the one that Tony mentioned, which is, you know, huge uncertainty internationally and nationally. And also pressure over critical services at local authority level, again means that authorities are cautious about holding and using reserves. Now, none of that says that the level is the correct level, and no doubt the Mayor is keen to have reserves in order to be flexible in the period from the draft budget to the final budget, or even in year, and we saw that, I think, in the use of funds to boost the ULEZ scrappage scheme. So there is a role for the use of budgets, but the question, as you say, is whether we've got the right level of budgets. Thanks.
Thank you, Stuart. Did anybody else have a thought on reserve? I'm just looking. Tony. Oh, and Jaggett. So let's. Very gentlemanly.
I mean, just to build on the points that have just made, there is no doubt, if you look across local government, there is this paradox that the more uncertain and the more uncertain the future is, and the greater the stress local government's budgets are under, the more local government builds up reserves. And it would only be an absolute certainty, impossible, into the future that would give finance officers here and elsewhere the confidence to begin to run those reserves down. Because this kind of environment, and the greater the uncertainty there is, the more it will encourage, and it's not a criticism, it's both a compliment and an observation, the more finance officers will want to protect their position so as to avoid what looks like to be a real risk of, not here but elsewhere, you know, a winter of Section 114 notices. Nobody wants to issue a Section 114 notice. Therefore, finance directors understandably build up reserves. Now, looking at the tables we were sent on page 10 of the document, only the person who wrote the document would understand what was in it. And again, I'm not being critical of the document, because it's impossible to know what all of these little numbers are. I know quite big for an individual household, but they're small in the context of a gross budget of £19 billion. And some of them appear to be flat over the long term, and that suggests the money is just sitting in an account in the long term. Some go down a bit, some are still there into the future. So, you know, the northern, the Northern Line extension appears to have a reserve going well off into the future, even though the line's now open. I'm sure there's a good reason for that. But it's hard for anybody sitting here, if I may speak on behalf of all of us here, possibly even sitting there, to know as much about what these reserves are than the people who put the document together. And I say I'm not being critical of them, because they're using this mode to be able to cope with any of the various uncertainties that might come up, and which they will want to avoid, as I say, getting anywhere near a Section 114 notice. So it's very hard. I think it's very hard for us, or indeed you, to be absolutely certain what all these numbers mean.
Understood.
But others may disagree with me.
Well, let's find out. Jaggett, what was your make an observation on the reserves?
Neil, thank you, Tony and Stuart, for making such excellent points. What struck me in this, when I was looking at the reserve numbers, and Tony's mentioned on page 10, is that if we look at the top table in page 10, reserves are halving over the next 3-year period. And if we look at the group reserves, they're doing about the same over that period. Now, if I look at it at aggregate level, I was trying to understand, is that a policy to reduce those reserves, or is it resulting from some decisions that we haven't thought about in the round? And whether you're a charity or a central bank in a country, you have a view as to what your, I use a word here that you may not agree with, optimal levels of reserves are. A bank even has a view as to what level of cash or reserves it may hold as a result of what it thinks the demand will be for cash from its tills over the next period, or the payments that it has to make. And what I didn't get from this is, what is our policy in these different areas? What do we need to hold the reserves for? Is it because we want to carry out certain expenditures even if some of the tax receipts haven't come in? Or is it because we're increasing expenditure in hope that taxes will go up at some point in the future, or there'll be a different kind of settlement from central government? It just wasn't at all clear where the reserves policy came from. And if I took at face value, the global reserves of 1.5 billion, that's a few weeks' reserves against expenditures. And I don't get a sense of whether that's appropriate or not. The one thing I would say, and it's not a disagreement with Tony or Stuart, is that one thing about reserves is to try and offset uncertainty. What we want from policies such as this is not to say uncertainty is this terrible thing that we can't do anything about, but to take a view, because of the forms of uncertainty that we're facing, whether it's to do with the number of people coming in, making trips into London, or the level of employment, the level of unemployment, or the demands that we might have on the public purse, is to then try and use policy to reduce the uncertainty, not to take it as given. That is the heart of good governance and good policy making. So let's not just always say it's something we can't do anything about. That's why we're here. That's why we have budgetary processes, is to try and offset uncertainty where we can. So that's two separate points.
I mean, just for context, obviously we do have a subsequent meeting where the person who writes that document does sit there and hopefully answer questions. So partly what we're interested in is, what questions we perhaps ought to be asking. So that's quite useful. I don't see any indication, so I will move on to section 2, which is about transport and infrastructure, where the first questions are from Assemblymember Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you. 4 of you said transport was one of the key priority areas going forward, and obviously the largest part of the overall GLA Group budget is spent at TfL on transport. I mean, how sustainable do you think TfL finances are from what you've seen so far? What are the biggest risks? Who would like to go first? I'm trying to look online as well. Should we do it in... say reverse order. Oh, Tony, are you waving? Let's go with Tony first then.
I mean, self-evidently, the biggest challenge. Well, there are two biggest. They can't be two biggest, but 2 serious challenges to TfL's long-term funding position. One is government funding settlement, or lack thereof, in the long term, and that's been beset by large and lowercase p politics for some time, if we can say that. But the other thing is the recovery of fare income, which, of course, as we all know, TfL is one of the most fare-dependent public transport systems of its kind in the world, or was traditionally. And when, at the depth of the pandemic, 95% of TfL's fare income went, that clearly exposed it, as it did the National Railway and the other bus systems, to an enormous challenge, bigger challenge than if it had raised more of its money from grants and subsidies. So the Paris system will have been less exposed than the London one, because the Paris system, raises less of its overall income from fares. So looking ahead, getting a reasonable certainty from UK national government about what TfL's funding position is in relation to national allocations of grants, and separately, more difficult in some ways, rebuilding its fare base, because its fare base, if you look at the GLA business plan before the pandemic and look at the most up-to-date figures in the budget, there's a big gap between what they were projecting out for 24-25 and what's actually now projected for 24-25. What none of us knows is what TfL, I think this will be worthy of the, if I may say so, this committee asking them, is what measures they have in place, or they're putting in place, to ensure they maximise their fare yield looking forward, not only in terms of fare levels, but in terms of changing the fare structure to recognise the fact that travel patterns may be different in the future than they were in the past, and most particularly that I'll put these words carefully, maximising the yield of a heavy commute in the early morning has gone. And that begs the question of a potentially different fare structure, which economists will know more about than me, in order to maximise fare yield while still being fair to fare payers.
So almost what is the new norm for commuting, if we can still call it commuting, and therefore how do you maximise income from that?
Yeah, when you can no longer be absolutely... I mean, there are implications here not only for fares, but also, frankly, for the pattern of services. I mean, if we return to a point where 100 or 110% of pre-COVID traffic is now there on a Saturday or in the evening, but only, I make it up, 60 or 70% on Monday and Friday, I'm not quite making it up, that has implications for the fare structure in the medium term.
Yeah. Okay,
if not now.
That's very helpful. Who else wants to come in? Lovely. I've got Jagjit and Tom online after. Jagjit, over to you first.
Tom, you don't mind if I...
Off you go.
I never want to say I know more than Tony about anything, so be clear about that.
Absolutely.
No, not really. But just reading stuff, I should say I don't live in London. I live quite far away, but I think the point Tony's making is absolutely right. Has TfL thought through the implications of the new structure of working patterns after COVID and decided how it wants to, in what sort of fare policies it wants to introduce? Let's take away some of the stylized facts that we do know after COVID. People are coming into the office around 2 to 3 days a week. It's 2.3, but I always put ranges around any estimate. I don't believe 2.3, 2 to 3. We know that younger people tend to prefer to come in if they can, because they want to build up skills, interactions and networks with people. And of course they're often living in homes that aren't large enough to make it that comfortable to work from home at. The traffic for TfL, from the things I've read recently, suggests it's about 70% of its pre-COVID levels. That's to give you an indication of the steady state fall in fares. And so there's some analysis to be done, not only in terms of maximising fares with respect to the travel that we see, which is one form of analysis, but also, and this might be something City Hall might want to think about more broadly, is how much to productivity do the agglomeration effects of people coming together in a persistent manner add to the workplace, firms' productivity, as well as the demand for other services that result from people coming in more often. We need that analysis. That might provide a locus for analysing the extent to which we might want to support TfL over and above its own analysis of how fares have fallen. Now, there is a live debate about the extent to which productivity is helped by working from home or hindered. I'm more on the side that thinks that the results that suggest during COVID, when we were working at home, suggest that that was more productive, was actually a function of us working really hard because we were in the middle of an existential crisis and we were all trying to get through it. So it's conflating the fact we were working hard to get through this crisis with the fact we were working from home. Now, if we work at home persistently, then I think there's a strong possibility, and the data is in its very early stages, that innovation may fail and younger people may not develop the skills that they need to get on with their careers and the networks that are so valuable to their future earning power. And I would think that kind of analysis would help us understand what is the optimal, sorry to use that word, but an optimal sort of view of TfL and its support going forward. I think we need that analysis to help us understand what
so maybe the GLA rather than just TfL need to be doing that analysis because it's part of the whole London economy.
Just thinking through that very, very carefully because I have seen proposals. I'm not backing them. I'm not a Londoner, but I have seen proposals for rethinking peak fares, for example, on a Friday to get people to come in. On a Friday, I have to come in to town on Friday sometimes, and I'm constantly disturbed by how quiet it is compared to my younger days when Friday was quite a rowdy day in town. Maybe that's a bad thing, but it was a good thing. And I kind of wonder whether that's appropriate for, again, I said in my opening remarks, this thriving world city that provides a leadership to the country. Should it be something that is quite so quiet on a Friday? But I'll leave that to others to make a decision.
Lovely, thank you. I've seen Tom wanted to come in, and then I'll bring Stuart. Tom.
Yeah, thanks very much. Completely agree with the points that both Tony and Jadget made there. I suppose one thing on Tony's plea for certainty from central government about the grants that are coming TfL's way, the truth is that will depend on the performance of fares as well. And there's, I think, sort of two distinct questions in a way. There's kind of the first question of how far are TfL's running costs being covered by fare income? And then the second question of how is the shortfall being made up? And depending on how big your answer to the first question is, that probably determines the share of the second question as well. And the chances are, if there is more of a gap between fares and operating revenue, certainly if the government feels that TfL has done its best to maximise that fare revenue, I think the government is then more likely to step in with some grants. And so I think to an extent those are two interlinked uncertainties rather than much. So I think it would be great to have much more certainty on that national grant allocation. I think in practical terms that's probably difficult. I suppose on the question of whether TfL's current model is sustainable, that really does come to the question of who is going to pay for it. We're not saying if fares don't cover income, therefore need to dramatically slash services, don't cover expenditure, rather we need to dramatically slash services, shut lines. No one's talking about that. The question is what's the appropriate level of subsidy and support and where that should come from. And that's where I think the kind of analysis that Jadget laid out about the broader benefits that London's transport system has, in effect a sort of externality coming out of the transport system that's bringing broader benefits to the economy, is an important part of the puzzle. And I suspect the answer will be that we want, it's a key part of what makes London London is the transport system, the ability to get around so easily on tube and bus. So I suspect the answer isn't going to be that we want to reduce services dramatically. It's going to be that we want to find new ways of paying for it. But I think a stronger analysis underpinning that would probably strengthen the case.
Lovely, thank you. And Stuart, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. First of all, I just wanted to say I agree very much with what Jadget said about the debate around hybrid working and the impact on individuals and organisations and indeed the London economy. And there's an opportunity for the GLA to take a lead in that as an important player in that world. I also think we should note that as I understand that the government has underwritten fares income at a level of £5 billion per annum, and without commenting on whether that's a fair or reasonable amount, it does at least provide a basis for planning, which takes some of the uncertainty over fares income out of the process. But I was keen to make a more general point on budget setting, which actually builds on something that Tom said earlier, which is that there's, in some ways, based on the material that I've seen, I would describe this as perhaps unkindly as a spender's budget. Which is to say, there's a set of commitments by the Mayor, which are new commitments, additional to what's gone before. And those drawing the budget together work very hard to find the money to address those commitments. But what's much more difficult to take a view on from outside, because of a certain lack of transparency, perhaps, is what's the trade-off between those different new commitments? What do you get for them? What's the target or the performance measure for the new commitments? How do the new commitments compare one to another across the budget? And indeed, how do they compare with the base budget, which probably gets less scrutiny and is rolled forward? Now, this is obviously very, very difficult stuff, and it may be that the Mayor's office has a lot of that information, or that you see it on a more regular basis. But just simply on the material that we've seen for this meeting, there's maybe more to do there in demonstrating that the correct trade-offs have been reached in transport and in other areas, and in scrutinising the entirety of the budget and the trade-offs that are involved. Even in an environment where the external funding is uncertain, as we've heard. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. I wanted to just pick up some specifics. I wanted to find out from you what you think TfL should be prioritising in terms of investments to have maximum impact on well, for Londoners. But can I perhaps go to Antonia first, because Centre for London have previously talked about single road user charging. Just wondering if you think that is where, is that where Centre for London thinks the Mayor should be prioritising? It could be another revenue stream, which would pick up the points Tom made earlier. Is that where you would prioritise, or are there other areas?
Thank you. So Centre for London has called for single road user charging for quite a while. But most recently, in our latest transport report, we've called for that alongside as well outer London specific transport strategy. And I think, and the reason I bring them up together is because I think we're seeing, particularly in outer London, that ULEZ as it's currently constructed isn't incentivising shorter journeys, and actually in some parts is, in some ways, is incentivising longer journeys. To put it into some basic example, if there's a B&Q a mile away within the ULEZ zone, or 20 miles away outside, people will travel longer in their car, whereas a single road user charging would mitigate that to some extent. I guess just to build on a couple of other people's comments, particularly thinking about what's been said about the need to rethink how London is travelling and commuting patterns and all the rest of it. I think alongside that, we know that the divisions between inner and outer London have only significantly grown. There's been a real divergence in terms of how people are travelling, but more generally between property values, between demographies, etc., between inner and outer London. We also know that a lot of the fallout around ULEZ has come from divisions between communities within inner and outer London. So I guess, long story short, I'm just saying we do see a real need for an outer London transport strategy specifically. It could also be used, for example, to kind of promote a more, polycentric sort of hubs of economic activity across the capital, etc. So I think single road user charging is definitely a priority.
Okay, thank you. Tony, could I pick up with you? I think you and LSE have recently called for an urgent focus on bus services in particular. And I'm just wondering what your thinking is around that. Is that the area you think TfL should be focusing on? I think I'd seen something about decline. Obviously, we've seen a decline in bus ridership more generally.
Maybe somebody at the LSE has. I'm not sure it was me, but which is not to say it's not an interesting.
Urgent focus on bus services, and
okay,
something came out recently.
I mean, we all know that in the long term, bus services, which have a very different demographic, have often been seen as the less prized element of TfL. There's a long tradition, which I think they know about internally, about the underground and railways being seen as the real thing, and they do produce a very large amount of revenue, by the way. Whereas buses, and going to the outer London point, there is no doubt that, and the debate about ultra-low emission zone made this very clear, that getting around outer London is substantially more difficult by public transport, or indeed potentially by any means in some places, than travelling around inner and central London. And that is a genuine difference which needs to be, it seems to be, a long-term, both a short-term and long-term priority for TfL, which is, whilst it's never going to be as easy to get round, Bromley or Hillingdon as it is the area which has been gifted by history, this remarkable public transport system based on railways and buses, it could be made better. So if you were looking for a long-term priority, it would be to improve bus services and perhaps look at more inventive use of tram and bus rapid transit type systems in outer London, because there is no doubt that people who live there tend to have worse public transport, and we know that there is an equity issue as well, that lower income households tend to use buses more than higher income households. So, you know, if you put the two things together, you know, in the outer London focus of public transport interventions in the future, given that it's not going to be massive amounts of capital for big tube investments in the medium term, you can see where that takes you.
And is the super loop that the Mayor has brought in, is that the answer?
Hard to tell yet. I mean, it might be. You know, orbital links in cities are always interesting ideas, and that's why the overground linking together a very, very efficient use of old rail track to create what has been an absolute game changer in terms of getting round sort of inner outer London boundary. Yeah. Given how well it worked there, it would be surprising if an equivalent system, it wouldn't be quite the same, at the edge of the city wouldn't also provide benefits, but it would have to be predictable, relatively high speed, and it would also have to be high frequency, and that is much more challenging for you know, mathematical reasons the further you go from the city centre. It's just a bigger circle.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very interesting discussion. I represent an outer London constituency, so I suppose I'm most particularly interested in hearing how hard done to we are. I have a supplementary question from Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to pick up on this thing about the outer London buses. And Antonia, Centre for London, has called for improvements to outer London bus services as a way of reducing dependency on private cars. But in particular, you recommend new bus routes for new housing developments, possibly paid for before they're even completed by a developer contribution. And I just wondered if you wanted to add anything on that in terms of things that we should be thinking about in terms of our questioning of the Mayor's team when we're questioning him on his budget.
Sure, thank you. I have to admit that paper was before my time, but I have seen it. So, yeah, as I think I understand it, the general argument for the policy is that via development of land, there could be something by way of a land value uplift tax that could fund the bus network or a bus network locally. I think that is kind of the correct approach. I think what Central London's research has historically shown is that the public sector has undervalued land when selling it to developers. I think most recently we did a study of the exchange between Barrett's and the Woolwich station of the Elizabeth line, and I think that the conclusion showed that essentially we felt that Barrett's and this isn't to single out Barrett's, this is just to show an example, but had sort of disproportionately benefited off the development around Woolwich station, and yes, perhaps we could sort of look to capture some of that uplift in value through a land value tax that could go further into public infrastructure, because we've also seen through the Elizabeth line that it has, the public capital investment has kind of more than paid for itself and actually far exceeded expectations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it, about population density, housing, development. Oh, sorry, Stuart, did you want to come in on that same question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on the outer London point. We used to think in very general and stereotypical terms that inner London was deprived, but it was also where all the jobs were, based on a 5-day commute. And outer London was quiet suburbia, and nothing happened there. And so much has changed over the past decade in the character of both inner and outer London. But what we have is a transport system which is still fundamentally based on radial routes and radial commuting. And I think what the debate on new bus routes speaks to is there needs to be better connectivity in the outer London space. But also needs to be a review of the allocation of resources, which would undoubtedly see a rebalancing across the capital. Thanks.
Thanks, Stu. I think that's definitely true. Tony.
Just to add one more thing, I know this is about this year's budget, but actually, to the point Antonia's made, given we've seen the Northern Line extension to Battersea, albeit it required a great deal of property uplift, which we can all have our views on, did help pay for it, and is a model that had to be negotiated line by officials at the then City Hall. I think the logic of finding a more easy-to-use mechanism to tie, for example, all the extra housing Michael Gove has recently said he'd like to see in an outer East London into DLR extensions, which I think TfL are talking to the government about, but it kind of needs not just a one-off, but a kind of continuous approach that allows developments, particularly large ones, to capture land value for the public good in a thought-through way, including developing public transport.
Yes, that's actually that was my thought that I was sort of interrupted just now. I think that this relationship between population density, new development, land value uplift, and cost of transport infrastructure, I think is a lot of untapped potential there. I think the next set of questions are from Assemblymember Baker, sticking with the theme of transport and infrastructure.
Hi, thanks for all coming today. So yes, I've got a couple more questions. I mean, we've wandered a lot around transport, so some of the stuff has already been covered, but feel free to restate or add or direct us to previous answers. My first question is, we're looking at, we asked about the sustainability of TfL's finances, and obviously we did talk about, the issues of resilience, reliance on fares. But so can you think of any ways that we could enhance the financial resilience of London's transport system? Is there anything that we're missing or that we're not prioritising enough that would help that our system become more financially sustainable? Go on, Tony.
Obviously there are short-term things that can be done, which include, we've mentioned this already, looking afresh at fares policy with a view to ensuring it's maximising within the bounds of rationality and fairness what those who use the system pay compared with those who don't use the system. It's a fair thing to look at, and TfL and the Mayor have agency in how they set that. They have complete control, really, an enormous amount of control. So I think that in the short term is definitely something. TfL, as we know, and it has been incentivised and encouraged to maximise its yield from other sources, from, I'm not sure going into being a house builder will produce much revenue in the short term, but it might in the medium to long term, I suppose. But then we're taken back into the longer term issue of how TfL and can be made more or less dependent on national government, and then you are immediately into issues of finding new and different income sources apart from the ones that are there now, or extending the ones that are already there. So it would be possible to raise more from council tax, never popular, but other city regional transport authorities in London tend to raise more than TfL has traditionally. And then you're straight into the congestion charge issue in the long term. And I've always, it's the personal view, whatever one thinks about congestion charge in outer London, that's or indeed anywhere other than where it is today, there is always the risk to London and any mayor of any party that if in the end London doesn't use the powers it has in this regard, then central government will eventually come along and do it and take the money to national government, to the exchequer. So that's just something to bear in mind all the time. that eventually a government will come along and could introduce a national system of road pricing that would take a lot of its revenue from London and the South East. Nothing wrong with that, if you believe in distribution around the country. It's just that that would then remove the power of London's government under any mayor to do it. So I realise it's politically contentious, but in terms of long-term sustainability of the city's finance system, transport system, I think you will have always to bear these things in mind.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything on that subject? Stuart?
I just wanted to note briefly in passing the role of technology in all of this. In many ways, TfL is a very impressive public sector organisation. The implementation of the congestion charge originally was very challenging and relatively smooth. But we're talking here about more flexible, more innovative and more dynamic pricing mechanisms which will require a further step change in technology and advanced thinking about how to secure that over a period. Thanks.
Thank you. Tom. Virtual Tom. Please do.
I would just add to what's been said already, particularly agreeing with Tony's points, that really the resilience of TfL's finances relies, of course, in large part on how the TfL system is being used, but also in the flexibility and resilience of the GLA's finances more broadly, and a world in which there were more alternative funding streams to help support TfL, as well as other GLA priorities, would be one in which there's perhaps further fiscal devolution and further powers devolved, probably not just to London, but to other major cities and city regions as well. And I mean, that certainly isn't something that's going to come around in time for this year's budget. But I think if really we're thinking about the resilience of some of these locally run services and systems, then ultimately that financial resilience will come from the flexibility that would come from further fiscal devolution, whether that be more fundamental devolution of our national taxes, or whether that be more opportunities for raising incremental taxes, tourist taxes and the like.
Thank you. So moving on, so we've talked about, we've drifted into various sort of specifics around what TfL should do, which were normally under their business plan. So the next question is, what are your views on TfL's 2023-26 business plan? Is there anything you would change? I know we've touched upon Out of London, touched upon buses, but please do. Is there anything else or anything you'd like to expand on? Stuart? No? Oh, no.
To be absolutely honest, I haven't read the business plan.
I did wonder when this question came up. I was like, have we made them read the whole of the business plan?
I haven't read it directly when preparing for the meeting, but I have looked at it. I've looked at it before, and I think what's striking about it, and it is germane to the discussion you're having here, which is that it's getting the fares back. I mean, I know it's going to sound like a cracked record here, but TfL is so dependent on fares, sort of 5, 6, 7 billion type figures, with very large numbers, and that's what's came out of the business plan to me. And the good thing about the business plan is that, in fairness to TfL, they do publish these business plans looking ahead, including income and expenditure figures. Now, other very large infrastructure projects that have been in the news recently don't do that to quite the same degree. And so, both the capital and revenue position of TfL is put in a business plan that we can all look at in terms of what's to be spent each year, how much income they get from different sources, and particularly, as I've said 14 times already, this fares issue. So, and I absolutely take Tom's point, in a better world than this, with a serious level of devolution to London, as to other big cities, it would be possible to have, the total amount of public expenditure in London is, I'm not sure we have the exact number, but if public spending in the UK is £1 trillion now, then the total amount of public spending in London must be 200 billion or of that order. So that's a very large sum that's being spent. It includes welfare benefits, of course. And there's very little discretion for the mayor or the mayor and the boroughs as compared with these very large departmental budgets as well. So, in a more devolved world, it would be possible to make decisions about the balance of public spending across this much bigger number. But TfL and the GLA don't have that discretion. They've only got it within their current budgets. But that means fair income. And this huge sum of fair income is vitally important to the whole autonomy of the GLA, because it's completely different to anything, any charges or fees available, aiming off the parking charges and fees in some London boroughs, but it's actually very different to anything else that exists in the rest of the country.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that and just to bring a couple of things together, and I think apologies for trying to test you on the business plan, but you have made various points on what you think should be sort of transport priorities. But this question of fares that comes up, when I was listening to the original, right up front when you're asked about what priorities were, some people were talking about the cost of living and income equality and things like that. And I'm just wondering whether anyone has any thoughts about how the interaction of our need to set the fares to an appropriate level of revenue and the situation of the cost of living being such a priority in London, how those things can interact. Any thoughts about the difficulties of that?
And the point I was going to make when we were talking about reserves as well, and it sort of applies at a global level, is that to the extent that you want to have security, financial security for GLA institutions and budgets, and you want to be risk averse and to manage those risks appropriately across the budget, you are by definition almost pushing that risk onto the households who rely on the different services and support that the GLA provides. So that just means you've got a trade-off that you have to recognise between the sort of endogenous integrity of the budget and the resilience of it, and the role. And I think Judge made a similar point actually, and the role it plays in terms of its public value good. And so fares is just one pinch point, if you like, of that in terms of, for obvious reasons, in terms of affordability of transport versus the financing of TfL. I mean, I think it does. I think perhaps something that hasn't been talked about too much is that, for this reason, I think it's important, again, in the round to think about, and I'd say this as an economist, not to conflate economic value with monetised value across the city. And actually, the jury's still out on home working and the effect on productivity, like absolutely. Apart from the points that Jaddy made, I mean, just the compositional effects during the pandemic makes it impossible to really know what was going on. But there is an access to work point. It's cheaper to get to work if you work from home. It's easier if you have a mobility challenge to get to work. It's easier if you're a parent and you've got caring responsibilities, in fact, caring of any kind. None of those things, when you're people working remotely, can be easily monetised, but they can be of enormous benefit to those individuals and then indirectly economic benefit, even if it isn't monetised at the point of it's really being realised. So the general remarks, but I don't have an answer to what the exact fair point is.
No, I wouldn't expect you to give it, but it's just thoughts on that balance, which is a difficult one. Yeah,
taking on risk and pushing it out.
Judge, yes.
So thank you. Listening to everybody, it seems to me the business plan. I had a copy of a bunch of slides I think TfL put together, so it's hard to see whether that was the full business plan. If it's not, I apologise. But what kind of occurred to me within that business plan, we might want a plan for increasing trips somewhere back towards where we were pre-COVID. And if that objective was met, that helps with the fare issues that we're talking about. It's going to be a very different fare strategy if trips remain at 70%, as opposed to a world in which trips are, say, back to 85 or 90%. And if that's a plan over a meaningful timescale, as Alfie was suggesting, that might actually be an appropriate use of reserves. Reserves are there in a sense to deal with particular one-off shocks that you can't deal with immediately, and a case can be made. Now, I'm not saying to you right now those reserves should be used for that reason, but when you have extreme events and an adjustment back to it, that's in fact, in a sort of theoretical sense, exactly the time you need to be using reserves if that's the objective. Now, because the outcomes will be uncertain, we might then need to be clear as to the progress we might expect on the way back to, let me just pull a number out of the air, 85%. We might expect after 3 years we're up to 80%, and if we're not, then we might want to rethink the strategy and the policy. So alongside any of these plans, I think we need indicators of progress. If we're going to increase the number of places that have streets in place, where do we expect to be in year 1, year 2, year 3, so we can assess our progress towards it. Classically, in a world of uncertainty, you need pinch points or markers all the way along to see if you're on track or not, and then to have worlds in which we can assess progress against that. That may require more independent expert advice, which I can only apologise, and it wouldn't be us doing it for you. But you might want to have that in line when you make these kinds of plans. It wasn't entirely clear to me. And then I think Tony mentioned as well, are we going to be controlling expenditures? Is that by sort of forward buying the work, writing contracts so they're controlled particularly well, or will we be subject to all kinds of shocks that mean that we won't be able to do the things that we want to do given a particular cash limit that we have in mind? It wasn't entirely clear to me from the document, but I realise I come to this as an outsider, and it could be that we have all those mechanisms in place. But clearly managing larger term capital projects in the way that we tend to do it in this country are ones that tend to take longer and turn out to be more expensive than we envisaged. And so in there somewhere we need to think very carefully about how we do that, and providing a certain level of credible commitment to carrying it out actually is quite a good way of containing the costs. If you're looking at them every year, you'll find that the counterparts are looking to increase the costs as well. That's a kind of well-known phenomenon in the area of public infrastructure. I hope those kind of generic points help.
Very helpful, very interesting. Thank you. Antonia.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of quick points from me. I guess building on what Alfie was saying about sort of economic and monetary value, I think something that potentially TfL could explore, but potentially, isn't a huge money maker, but I think it would draw more people onto the service, would be essentially TfL working in tandem with other public institutions across London to offer incentives for their employees to use TfL sort of transport options. I know to some extent that's in place, but I don't see why sort of it couldn't go via a network such as the London Anchor Institutions Network and kind of all of the institutions that sit within that network, and some kind of offer to their employees. And then the only other thing I was going to flag was thinking about the both the cost of living and sort of fair pinch points, but then also thinking about the need to incentivise more low carbon transport. I think one thing that we've seen in our research is the massive expansion of micromobility and reliance on micromobility, but still that being predominantly available within inner London. So I think from Centre for London's perspective, obviously expanding that to have a good level of accessibility in outer London is one thing, but then also potentially integrating payments with TfL payments could be another route forward to make things a little bit more sustainable. Thanks.
Thanks, Antonia. Stuart.
I think we should just note also that there are a few things more political than the level of transport charges and who pays for them, and that's what drives you away from the economically optimum solutions often.
Thank you. Tony, and then Tom.
No, well, I've spoken already. Okay, I mean, just two things. It's interesting that the government itself, central government, has made, to Stuart's point, a lot of political capital recently out of holding down bus fares outside London. So they are very political. They're very easy to feel, bus fares, when you're paying them, even if you're paying with a tap-in, tap-out card, which people are out of London more than they used to. TfL's in gift to many other places, actually. And so that's one thing to bear in mind. But I think it's the other, going back again to something Stuart said earlier, this debate about value for money, fare levels and so on, and I know I'm slightly straying outside fare, it is worth remembering that, particularly with bus systems, that it's not just what people pay, but what they get. And there's no doubt that the bus system has not been helped in recent years by enormous impediments to buses moving quickly, to put it the other way around. I mean, buses don't, if you look at inner and central London, there are many fewer vehicles using the streets than there were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and bus speeds are hardly changed. That's a conundrum to wrestle with. And more generally, if buses were radically speeded up, and think of the initiatives over 50 or 60 years to do this, and yet still people will use trains more often than DLR because it is quicker. And there's a great big efficiency and productivity gain to be found there, which I suspect has something to do with the utilities and road management and another inquiry, but it is worth remembering that there's a productivity and output and outcome side of all of this, as well as I know you all know this, but an input and money side, which I think we all need to keep bearing in mind.
Thanks, that's a helpful point. And Tom, finally.
Yeah, thanks very much. On the TfL business plan, I have the benefit of being at home and having a second screen that I can put up that plan, which is certainly helpful. I would say one thing that I had looked at it before as well, one thing that is impressive is the clear set of targets for 2030. But what's striking, and would agree with Tony on how reliant it is on fare income and usage recovering, but also how ambitious many of the targets are. For example, increasing mode share not by sustainable modes by 10 percentage points by 2030. And I think often with these strategies, you can set something out to around 2030, thinking it's quite a long way away, and actually it's really not that far. And one point I wanted to make on that was, one thing we've not talked about is active travel and the role that better active travel can play. And I think in economic terms, it's likely to be fairly small, but in terms of reaching green goals and so on, it is important. And I think that's another area probably where there's been more progress seen in bits of inner London than there has in outer London generally. And on the point about fares, I mean, we're all sort of speculating that there might be a different way of setting fares that might generate a more optimal outcome. There's that word again. And that's very likely, but it's important to emphasize how much we're all sort of flying blind, because there is no evidence base to draw on. For the political reasons that Stuart sets out, we can't sort of do random experiments with fares to try and work out people's willingness to pay and how much, and to use Economist language, how elastic demand is for the transport system. But I think that is another reason why, for example, looking at experimentations perhaps with Mondays and Fridays, where people tend to be in much less, might be especially useful to understand how responsive actually is sort of post-pandemic demands to the price of transport. We're in a position where London is such an exceptional system within the UK that you can't exactly look to other systems to learn lessons on that. And I think that's another reason why, just building up the evidence base and being able to make better decisions, another reason why it would be beneficial to try to look for some form of experimentation, even if it's just on specific days.
That's very interesting. Thanks very much. If TfL were here, I'm sure they'd say they had a ton of evidence base for it, but I'm definitely not here to speak them. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Again, there will be a meeting where TfL are here, so we can ask some of these questions to them. They do have a lot of insight to their own fares, but you're right, there's a lot of unknowables. So we now move on to the next section, which is policing and crime. And just to sort of put up a little foreshadowing, if I can put it that way, sounds a bit ominous. At the end of that section, we'll have a short comfort break. So that's more of a light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps sticking with our transport theme. Assembly Member Harani on policing and crime.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll start off with a quite easy and very non-controversial question for any of the panellists to come in first. Which is, do you feel that the Met and MOPAC are providing value for money for Londoners? Difficult one. Tony?
I mean, as we've discussed, I think this is a generic issue and you're aware of it, we're all aware of it. I think it's very hard to tell. I'm struck again and again and again, if I just distance it from this chamber and the GLA, how when any organisation, including the IFG this morning, comes along and offers a mild critique of central government, somebody speaking for the government will come up and say, well, we're spending X billion pounds on this, as if somehow we're spending X million or billion pounds is the answer to anything. So I think Stuart made this point first, and I absolutely agree that it's very hard to assess outputs, outcomes, value for money, productivity, because the indicators change regularly. I'm not just saying at the Met, but generically across government, people are endlessly changing indicators, targets for different levels of periods, and so on. And we know in the case of policing, so many of the indicators are contested, they're hard to measure. Do you look at the crime survey, or do you look at the actual numbers of crimes recorded, and so on and so on. So I think that policing, perhaps even more than transport, at least with transport you've got the number of people using the system and satisfaction surveys and punctuality figures, none of which are that contested. In policing, the data are contested, they're often changed, and the public has perceptions of crime and risk of crime, which often vary from the actual level of crime and risks of crime. I'm sure we all do. So I do think that as a general theme for the day, perhaps the committee can help the GLA think into the medium term about having a smaller number of agreed long-term indicators for services which we stick to for some time.
Stuart, so lots of nodding there. So
I absolutely agree with that. It is partly the nature of the service and partly the approach that's been taken in recent years makes it almost impossible to form any evidence-based assessment of value for money. But the thing that I would mention that I think is very important in community perception is the kind of cultural issues that we've seen get great prominence over the past year. Although those might not be directly related to the productivity of the service, they're certainly going to affect the perception of individuals and communities of that service. Thank you.
Good. I can see Tom's hand up online.
Thanks. Just to add on the productivity points, the ONS provides sort of productivity indices for different public services, and police is one of the few where they don't even try to define a set of outputs. They just define productivity for the police as input equals output, so basically equals 100 every time. But I think reflecting on some of the police is one of the 9 public services that the Institute for Government looks at, and I suppose what are the outcomes or outputs you might want from the police? Well, that might be being able to charge more. How many crimes are they charging? It might be the sort of trust in the police that people have and the sort of confidence that they have. And I think on both of those metrics, you'd say, hard as it is to define whether it's value for money, that on those metrics, the Met is not doing as well on those things as it was doing 5 or 6 years ago. And certainly the cultural challenges that Stuart's really alluded to certainly play into the latter of those, and those certainly are challenges. And I think that is an important part of what the police is providing, is that confidence that people within London can trust that they'll be dealt with fairly and that crimes will be punished. And so I think that those are challenges that at least suggest that it's been trending in the wrong direction in the last few years, even if we can't put any sort of objective number on it.
Thanks. Jagjit?
Sorry, thank you much. I mean, apart from the obvious remark that police are getting younger, but that's certainly my age rather than anything else. One thing that struck me, and make the very accurate points, that it's very hard to measure public sector productivity, but particularly in the area of policing, is the number of people arrested going up a good or a bad thing? It's very hard to understand which way that might go. In a more peaceful society, you might accept it to fall. if they're doing their job, you might expect more people to get arrested. So it's incredibly difficult to get a handle on that. But one stylised fact that did strike me when I was reading this is the number of vacancies. It just seems to be an enduring and ongoing issue. I happen to know from other contacts there's a problem in the prison service as well. And if we've got something like a 3% shortfall of officers that affects the grant as well from central government, there's an interesting question as to why that is. That might reveal some interesting information for us. Is it about wages? Is it quits? Is it that we're not providing sufficient training so people understand what the nature of the job is? As a one-off number, it's hard to understand what's driving that. And that might be very interesting information from us that might, in an indirect sense, help us understand some of the issues that are going on here. Or is it just wages? I don't know. But it seems to me it came up in three or four different parts of the report. And it might be an issue for us to be thinking a little bit deeper about as to why there is this level of vacancies on an ongoing basis. I don't know the answer, I should say.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, thanks. I might ask this next question differently given the answers that some of you have given for the first question on value for money, because it was originally going to be about if there was additional funding, what areas should the Met be prioritising, or where should these funds be directed. But in terms of areas for the Met Police to work on in 24-25, are there any specific areas that you feel they should be focusing on? Should more resources or more time be available to look and focus on these issues? You mentioned vacancies, but are there any others that panellists would like to come in on? Tony?
It seems to me that, I mean, we've got politicians certainly in both the major political parties, the Conservative and Labour parties, making statements within living memory about the need to bear down on what you might broadly define antisocial behaviour. It's something that politicians of all parties, understandably, want to tackle. And I think there is it's clear, and it's slightly going beyond the budget committee, I realise, but it is to do with outputs and outcomes. There's an enormous gap between what the police can realistically do and what local government, the boroughs in particular, can do. And quite a lot of the aggravating antisocial challenges facing people of all walks of life fit in that gap. And so it seems to me that if there is any additional resource, trying to find a way of working with the boroughs in particular to tackle these often very local, very neighbourhood issues, it would be a good use of the money, because there's some things the boroughs can do, though they'll need police help, and there are many things the police could do if they had the kind of intelligence and information that the boroughs have. So that's where I think there is a gap in the functional capacity of policing with a lowercase broadly defined.
Thank you. Antonia?
Thank you. Yeah, just quickly from me. I mean, I think something that we've been speaking about a bit at Centre for London recently is what has just been mentioned about the vacancy challenge within the Met, and I think that alongside trust in the Met being very low, the force being under special measures, I think it's 1 in 30 police officers currently suspended from duty. It feels that the mood is ripe for some change, and I think that when it comes to the vacancy challenge, we have seen that there have been many efforts to promote inclusive recruitment or recruitment from communities that are underrepresented within the Met, and as far as we've seen at Centre for London, that hasn't really resulted in the objectives that were set when all of those kind of outreach programmes begun. So I guess I would wonder whether those kind of recruitment drives are sufficient, and whether there's actually some need for something additional in terms of wraparound support for those communities to have the confidence and desire to start sort of careers in the Met. I'm sort of thinking maybe something like an intermediary labour market scheme or something additional on top of the efforts that have taken place to date, which I think we would probably on balance assess haven't really worked.
Stuart?
Tony makes an important point about the relationships between the Met and local authorities, and there's a more general point here about the kind of dialogue and partnership working between local services, which has had an awful lot less emphasis in the past decade or so, and there are almost certainly missed opportunities there. And the GLA, of course, in London can have a convening role for that kind of initiative. As far as Met priorities are concerned, and this, of course, won't be any surprise to the service itself, the one I would mention is personal fraud. For which the figures are horrifying, and it's in many ways it's a hidden crime. People are often keen not to report it. The costs can fall on financial institutions rather than individuals, and so in some ways it's hidden, but it is growing at a terrifying rate. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that before I actually bring Tom in, because that was going to be sort of one of my points I specifically asked to Tom, because I also have the benefit of a screen in front of me, and I'm looking at some of the information that's come out from Institution for Government today, and it, one of the main headlines is that fraud and computer misuse now account for half of all crime. From the figures that your organisations has published today. Just looking, if you can just draw on that as well, or if you had any additional points to make on that issue, on the question of what the police should be looking at or prioritising, just to reflect on that. I mean, in that time, crime is becoming more complex and very different to what it was over the decades, and it almost feels like in every aspect we always play catch up. Not just on policing, but on other areas where you're always constantly catching up with technology. So just with that in mind, I'll bring Tom in.
Yeah, thanks. And fraud was exactly part of the point that I was going to make. Certainly is a key theme from our police analysis and performance tracker with SITFA this morning. Highlighting how fraud has continued to increase, and for consistency reasons, crime stats are often published excluding fraud and computer misuse, because the way it's been calculated over time has changed. But I think it's increasingly problematic to ignore it, given, as you say, what a big part of the crime total it is. The other area and type of crime that's naturally been a very big focus in the last few years is sexual offences as well, which again is an incredibly complex type of crime that takes a lot longer to solve. I think one issue I suppose I would raise there is that the type of expertise, the type of resource, the type of officer that you want to deal with those kinds of crimes is probably not your sort of new recruit Bobby on the beats, or indeed a PCS, whether that's neighbourhood policing or indeed a PCSO, which I know has been a focus of the Met and hiring more, which is not to say that doing that is not a good thing, because there's evidence to show that more of a police presence, more neighbourhood policing or more PCSOs is a good way of rebuilding trust with the community. And clearly with the Met, I think that does need to be a priority. But it's to highlight that there is a bit of a trade-off between, are you spending your resources dealing with identifying and charging complex crime, or are you spending your time, in the community, yes, intelligence gathering, but partly sort of building that generalised trust. And over time, you would hope that the two would be more complementary. But certainly in the short term, there is a bit of a trade-off to be made. I think given where the Met is, it's completely understandable and completely right to be focusing on hiring more PCSOs. Naturally, as we've been focusing on hiring lots of officers, lots of officers tend to be very junior, and junior officers are not going to be particularly effective in those more complex roles anyway. But I do think, as you're asking questions going forward, that question of, is the structure of the workforce well set up to deal with the types of crime, I think sexual offences and fraud being two that are particular focuses, how well set up is the structure of the workforce to deal with those problems?
Thank you. Just conscious we are sort of stepping into actual issues rather than sort of the main budgeting issues are, but I'm taking confidence, trust and confidence in the fact that Assembly Member Russell's here, who chairs policing and crime. So I'm sure she'll take she's making plenty of notes and will take that forward in that committee as well. Just a final question from me about the capital programme underspends, and whether panellists have had a chance to look at that in terms of the MPS who've had historic issues with the capital programme underspends and project slippage over the last 6 to 7 years. What best practices could you or would you recommend to enhance the performance of their capital programme, if any? I understand it's looking into quite granular detail into one specific part, but... Tony?
I mean, again, it's one of these things which is a great question, perfectly respectable. We should be able to answer it, but we can't. I can't. And the reason I say that is that we don't have enough information about, and this is perhaps somewhere to go, about the estate. I mean, anecdotally, I walk around London and see a mixture of in-use police estate, not in-use police estate, some that's been turned into housing, some that's disappeared, whatever. But I think unless outsiders to the service have a really sort of detailed sense of what the entire police estate is, how much of it is in use, and where the bits are that aren't in use are, it's very hard to judge whether the capital programme is proceeding fast enough towards using those resources efficiently, given that the number of, and I know it's highly controversial, but the actual number of police stations and outposts has reduced substantially in recent decades under leadership of all parties and different types. So, I think that what this tells us is that the more the Assembly knows about the estate where you're seeking to judge whether it's being efficiently and effectively used or not, the better. And again, and I put this as delicately as I can, and I don't mean just about the police is funny. I think inside public institutions, there is very often a desire to ensure that those managing the finances have a full understanding of it all, perhaps less willingness to allow those outside fully to understand what there is, in order that pressure can be brought to bear and judgments made about the progress of whatever the project is. And local government's much better than this than national government, for the avoidance of doubt.
Stuart?
I think the first observation I make is that the techniques for managing capital programmes have improved enormously in the public sector, generally both in local and in central government over the past decade. Not always evidenced in the progress on the ground, of course, but the techniques that are available are much stronger now, which raises the question in my mind about the degree of knowledge sharing and best practice sharing across the GLA group. I mean, TfL must surely be one of the best organisations in the country at managing capital programmes, and what exchanges there with the Met Police on those issues.
Thank you. That's it for me.
Yes, you mentioned the estate strategy. I've only been an Assembly member, I'm in my 3rd year, so I actually couldn't tell you how long the Assembly has been waiting for the Met Police's estate strategy. I would have to defer to my more long-standing colleague, but more than 3 years.
Before the last election, and then it got delayed till after, and then it's been remodelled, and it's now really not going to come out till after next month.
Some considerable time, it would be fair to say. Okay, so we will now have a short comfort break of 5 minutes. So if we return at 3:46 by my watch, I'm afraid I have to keep hold of my watch, but hopefully your watch looks similar. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes' time when we'll be looking at housing and development. Thanks, everyone. Okay, welcome back to the second half of our Budget and Performance Committee this afternoon, where we have our panel of experts looking at different aspects of the Mayor's budget and strategy. We now continue with the next section, which is on housing and city development. So I think for reasons of time, I'm going to truncate my thoughts. So this is my section. I'm going to truncate it, I think, to one question, thinking about both the affordable home program that the GLA itself has, and perhaps TfL's housing program as well, and also thinking more broadly. Obviously, most housing in the city is not run or built by TfL or the GLA. What can be done in London to improve affordability of housing, both affordable housing with a capital A, subsidised housing, and affordable housing with a lowercase a pipe dream? Who would like to kick off on the question of housing? There is nothing that could be done to improve the situation of housing in our great city. I don't know. I mean, Alfie, I know you were making some observations earlier about budget pressures. Obviously, probably the single biggest budget pressure for most families is going to be their housing costs. I don't know whether you have sort of thoughts on what could be done to alleviate some of that pressure.
Yeah, I think a lot of the levers to alleviate immediate pressure don't sit inside GLA control, which I think is one of many challenges for this particular problem. You know, local housing allowance would be a big one. You can use discretionary pots in London, but you know, it's a national framework. Housing benefit, regulation of the private sector. There's limitations again. You know, the Mayor's obviously made a big thing around previously, has talked about, has had rhetoric around rent control. But again, this is campaigning, not governance. I think at this point in time, given the current powers. One of the remarks I meant in the opening, I think, was if we are talking about the kind of category of things you can do quite quickly, and even here it's not an immediate quick fix. But you know, if you step back, one of the things you think is obvious is that too much of housing sits in the PRS and the private rented sector in terms of if you're going to try and design this optimally or in a way that maximises some sort of utility. I think PRS is over relied upon in London, and therefore you should be looking at a mix of strategies to rebalance. If you're being opportunistic and again sort of trying to move quickly, I think, as I said earlier, this high interest rate environment is making the position very hard for landlords. There are landlords who are organically looking to move to a sell position in some instances, and I think that is an opportunity in terms of where it's appropriate, you know, where the conditions are right, the property's right. There is a an affordable housing-led sort of institution that can pick up the properties. I think we should be looking for where grant can make that transaction possible, and either the council, local authority, or housing association provided with resources to purchase those properties, bring them into affordable housing supply. You know, and that's not about adding supply overall. It's about recomposition and making existing supply more affordable where that's possible. But that does mean it's also a bit quicker because you're not building a new house, you're changing the stream that's delivering it.
When you mentioned rebalancing, you're talking about between sort of owner occupying, private rented, social rented, maybe some kind of, you know, what's it called, the sort of part rent, part buy, all of these different structures that you're talking about rebalancing between those.
Between 10 years, exactly.
Okay, understood. Jagjit and I've seen Antonia as well.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start again with a couple of stylised facts, if I might. One is that it's a very tight labour market in London. The ratio of unemployment to vacancies is around 2.5. So, vacancies to unemployment. There's 2.5 vacancies chasing every unemployed person. The national average is 1.5. It's a very tight labour market. Real wages, on average, look as though they're going to be rising, again, on average. And I said earlier on that the rental market is also tight, with rental prices rising. So that means in there somewhere there's a demand for housing in London, and therefore we need to think about how we meet the supply. Now, while I appreciate it's not entirely within control of GLA, but where it has influence and its ability to bring about some change, I would encourage house building, home building, in any way that it can. There are many brownfield sites, not necessarily in central London, but in the periphery, or what do we call it, suburbs, or whatever. Yeah, sorry, out of my depth when I get to geography. In the periphery that could easily be developed, and that we know requires some thought to the planning restrictions and the length of time it takes to get these things passed. If we can work towards easing that, we can get more homes built. And of course, one thing that has worked in other parts of the country is to encourage more affordable housing to be built alongside any private sector housing plans. We could increase the ratio, and again, to the extent to which that's not within the GLA's direct decision making, it's something it could bring to bear with developers to increase the proportion of affordable housing that's built alongside any new developments. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there's clearly demand for workers in London that's currently outstripping the number of people who could do the job. It's, for the moment, expensive to commute. So that we need to think about making those housing costs cheaper, and the most obvious way of doing that is to do what we can to increase the supply and make planning restrictions easier to get through than have to wait for a long time. So these are maybe big picture points that can't be acted upon immediately, but nothing that has the scale of this problem attached to it can be solved with one budget alone. So we need to think about how many more houses do we need, how much more accommodation do we need, potentially over 4 to 5 to 6 year horizon, and then make that step in the next budget part of what we do. We're not going to solve it in one day, and make a longer term commitment to that.
Understood. Thank you. Antonia, I've also seen Stuart afterwards.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, very much agree with everything that's been said. And I guess, again, thinking about the remit of the GLA, and but also perhaps the uniqueness of London's housing issues. I think, again, not something for the remit of this budget, but potentially longer term. I think housing as a hook to call for further devolved powers for the GLA should be a priority. And just to flag a couple of facts that were in our latest report on housing, we know that and just to illustrate kind of how perhaps unique or divergent the situation is in London, we know that demand for temporary accommodation is already the highest in England, and it increased by a further 5% this year. We also know that in London, housing costs account for, on average, 40% of household income, and that compares to the England average of 26%. And we also know that after paying for housing costs in London, 25% of Londoners live in poverty. So I think it is a really unique situation in London, and perhaps, the GLA sort of flagging that and kind of using it as a hook to call for further devolved powers, maybe an idea. In addition to what's already been suggested by other panellists, some things that Centre for London have recently called for would be firstly around redefining the formal definition of affordable. I know that's come from many campaigning groups, but at present I think it is defined at 80% of market rate, which is still well out the bounds of affordable for many people, particularly if it's a new development of fairly expensive properties. Obviously, affordability as a term is kind of it's a two-sided coin. On the one hand, it is the price that you're paying for housing, but on the flip side, it's what you're getting for that price. And I think we've seen a few councils within London experiment with sort of selective property licensing, and I think that is something that the GLA could explore to make sort of uniform across London. The other thing that I was going to flag was just around building on the green belt. The Centre for London for quite a while has advocated for a rethink around that. There was a study from Centre for Cities that came out, I think, last year that showed that by building on 1% of the green belt, or freeing up 1% of the green belt, we could see over 300,000 homes built just on 1%. And I think with that as well, there's perhaps scope for the GLA to spend some time sort of redefining public's perceptions of what the green belt is as well, because I think there's perhaps an idea of it being, rolling hills of flowers or something, but a lot of it is, it is not that at all, and particularly actually where the land in and around kind of public transport stations, etc., could be some of the most viable for property building and is, let's say, unsightly. The final thing that I was just going to flag, and I don't particularly want any follow-up questions on this because I'm not an expert on it, but was just that I've had a few conversations, as I said, only been in post for a month, but with various councils that are struggling to sort of move forward new developments because of limits to the electricity grid actually in their area, and I think that's something that I haven't heard talked about much, but I mean, if that is the case and we are kind of reaching close to capacity on a lot of the borough-wide electricity grids, obviously that needs to be addressed as well.
Yeah, I think particularly southwest London is where I hear that happening more so than elsewhere.
Really?
Yeah, there's definitely not a myth, I think, certainly that in that bit of the city. Stuart.
I absolutely agree with those points on the green belt. Just standing back for a moment from the budget setting process, I think there's a real opportunity here for the GLA at this point in the political cycle. Both main parties have committed themselves for different reasons and in different ways to significant house building, and there's an opportunity for the GLA to identify the obstacles that you have faced in making faster progress, and to lobby for those up to and through the next election.
Thanks. This is, I'm just looking at my own clock. It's my job to keep myself to time, so I'm going to request that maybe this is a written answer, Antonia. But I was interested in your point about the, what was it, 40% versus 26% of income in London versus outside London. And I wondered how much of that was a composition effect, because you have, say, retired people who have paid off their mortgage, who have virtually zero housing cost, and maybe there's fewer of those in London. So I don't know if you were able to dig out those figures, you could perhaps write to us. I was interested in what a like-for-like comparison looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I will just send through the report that, details.
Oh, well, that would definitely save everybody some time. Thank you very much. So our next section is on the environment, which is Caroline, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so at the beginning, lots of you talked about, well, Tony described it as epic uncertainty. Stuart talked about there not being enough long-term thinking. Several of you mentioned climate as one of the priorities. And then, Alfie, you mentioned the living standards crisis. And in a sense, all of that comes together when you start looking at climate work and the work that the Mayor does on the environment, because we have some of the leakiest homes in Europe. And if we are going to, and we have Londoners experiencing a devastating cost of living crisis and having to put up with escalating energy costs at the same time. And we haven't touched on what's going on the LLDC with the kind of heating charges today, and I won't go into that, but it's right now. But there are huge issues around access to heat for people's homes. So my first question is just generally about the GLA's new climate budgeting process. So the Mayor of London is learning from the Mayor of Oslo about a climate budgeting process, and every single part of the GLA budget has to go through a climate budget process, and there are very complicated spreadsheets sort of backing it all up behind hand. So just generally, what are your impressions of the climate budgeting approach? Do you think it looks as if it's an effective tool? I appreciate we're just going into the second year of it. And do you have any suggestions for how the process could be improved? And I do realise you may not be deeply into the detail of the Mayor's climate budgeting process. Does anyone want to jump in? Online. Tom.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't claim to be an expert in the process, but I suppose a couple of general points. Firstly, I think that it's a very welcome initiative and a good idea, given generally the climate crisis, but in particular London's commitment to getting to net zero by 2030. That's the kind of target that you're only going to make if you're measuring all of the contributions to it and really understanding, where you're most off track, where you're most on track, and so on. So certainly, I think it's a welcome initiative. I think with all of these things, and probably many other similar initiatives, they're kind of as useful as people looking at them make it. So I think if this is just a sort of additional set of numbers that's published without much scrutiny, without any sort of sense of a binding constraint, then I think it's still on balance a good set of information sharing, but not exactly a transformative tool for how the budget is made. On the other hand, if it is seen much more as a binding constraint, so if it's not just setting out how much of a carbon contribution is being made, but there are limits being set on how much of a carbon contribution can be made in particular years, perhaps to ensure that London is on course to reach its 2030 target along some plausible trajectory. At that point, it really becomes a genuinely useful tool that is binding decisions, I suppose. So I'm afraid that stays slightly in the generalities, but I do think measuring this kind of thing is very important, but actually paying attention to what it says and ensuring it's actually a constraint is what will make it a really useful exercise.
Thank you. Yes, Stuart.
Like Tom, I was very, very pleased to see this. I didn't know about it in advance of preparing for this meeting. The efforts to accumulate evidence to inform decision making is absolutely central to this, but the test is whether it influences the decisions that are made, what is done and how it's done. The key to that is both transparency and accountability. And often the trick there is external accountability. So an interesting question for me is who is looking at this information and forming an external view on whether it has actually changed the activities of the organisation. Thanks.
So in exactly the same vein, can we, in next year's report, point to particular decisions that were reversed or changed in terms of their priorities as a result of what economists call the shadow price of particular interventions that we might have? Presumably, across a set of interventions or policies that we have, if we're able to attach a carbon impact to all of them, then that would be weighed alongside the social impact or the economic response that we have. To demonstrate that, in some sense, that led to then a change in priorities, to illustrate and motivate people to think about better alternatives that would be carbon efficient. And I think that would help us have more credibility that this just wasn't an exercise, if I could use the word in some sense, for marketing or saying that we're committed to green policies, but actually to demonstrate that it led to a change in policies. And I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I think what we saw through, I mean, last year we were just looking at Scope 1 emissions and just for the GLA. So, but what it did do was get GLA bodies to start thinking about, well, if we're replacing, if our heating system, you know, if we're going to meet net zero by 2030, we can't replace any gas boilers. We've got to work out how we can get our buildings up to standard and so that they can be heated with a heat pump. And so I think it does appear to be prompting that kind of longer term thinking that in terms of the investments that the police, the Transport for London and other GLA bodies are making. So it does feel like we're seeing something. It's obviously this year we're looking at Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and not just for the GLA group, but also for London. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in terms of what we actually get to see in the budget papers.
And do we have a sort of do we have a view about the sort of path along which the carbon emissions would fall over time, in the sense in which if we do more earlier, that's beneficial rather than doing things later? Have we got a timeline in aggregate?
There are some timelines, and I think that they are realising just how challenging. I mean, I think what the process is doing is opening up everyone's eyes to the challenge of a 2030 net zero target. But you know, we're being told they are still aiming to hit that.
Thank you.
Tony.
mean, obviously, and the point's already been made, this is, I mean, we all know about 98% of all budgets in all public sector institutions are 98% determined this year for next year. So we're always talking about that tiny margin at the edge where something's stopped or there's a fraction more money, whatever. So obviously this sphere of policy where there is a need for relatively rapid change begs questions about how those new resources are used, it seems to me. First, how new resources, or where it's possible via regulatory change, not all of which is within the GLA's purview, can bring about relatively swift change in behaviour, and we know it can do. But so I think part of it will be about, I can see, budgeting within the GLA group and possibly more widely. But more generally, this is a bit like public health, an invest to save challenge. It's an invest to save challenge, and famously, what always looks to everybody outside some parts of government as entirely sensible. I think if we invest this, we're going to get that back in the medium term. As with public health, doesn't always land well inside some parts of government. So the question of how investing to save can be made an element in this kind of new way of looking at budgeting. I totally agree that presenting people with information which allow them to make choices they otherwise wouldn't have made is absolutely common sense. But I definitely think this needs always to be presented in a sort of, if we do this in the medium to long term, you individually, your house will be less leaky. The world will be better off. I know you know that, but I just think it's worth reiterating it.
And actually that sort of brings me to the next question, which is about sort of, how these kind of long-term efforts sort of within that sort of environmental space, how those long-term policies go hand in hand with improving the lives of the poorest Londoners. So particularly, so we've seen with ULEZ, obviously everyone benefits, and everyone is already benefiting from fewer vehicle emissions and cleaner air, which is great for the health of some of the poorest Londoners who suffer disproportionately from COPD, from lung and heart health conditions. But there's and so we've had a huge sort of effort on scrappage to make sure that the lowest income Londoners are not disbenefited by that sort of big London-wide environmental policy. Yes, sort of, and I was wondering, Alfie, if you had any thoughts on this. Just kind of the again going back to the idea of the leakiest homes in Europe. If you've got any sort of observations really in terms of from the Joseph Rowntree perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think home retrofit energy efficiency is a big priority and something that can be done at city level. When we were talking a little while ago to the Treasury about their view on why it's so slow in this country, because you're absolutely right, the housing stock is poor by compared to country standards. They felt as though the challenge was less on the sort of demand side. Can we put in place the grant? Can we price energy in the right way to get people to invest in home retrofit? I mean, actually, the binding constraint was on the supply side and the workforce, and the capacity for current solutions to go in and retrofit homes in the way that we currently are unable to do so. And so I do wonder whether there's something in, I think number one, I think this is an important area. It's a thing to prioritise. I think it'd be something to, you could put political weight behind as GLA, as mayor, and try and do something faster in London as an example to the rest of the country. But I think it's a twin approach of thinking about who can pay for this, what's the demand side solutions you can put in place to make sure that happens. But probably it's then very quickly turning to who's going to do the work and how do you make it feasible and on what time frame, because I think that is the bit where it tends to get sticky and why it hasn't. Some of the schemes that have been tried in the past at national level have not accelerated as fast as was previously hoped.
Because there aren't the people who understand how to do the retrofit, but also how to manage those big retrofit projects, because if you're trying to retrofit a whole estate or kind of whole streets of homes at once, then you need people who are capable of managing that kind of project. And I think there does appear to be a shortage of people with those particular skills. Tony?
Having been slightly disobliging about the Office for National Statistics earlier on, let me say something nice about the census. Because one of the the census has produced all sorts of intriguing facts about the whole country, but one of the most, to your point, interesting ones I saw was that partly because of the existence of a large private rental sector, in a very large PRS sector in London, that the homes, I think I've got this right, it's all being broadcast, so when I get it wrong, everybody will know. I think that the homes which were least likely to have central heating and good heating were the PRS properties in central London, boroughs like Westminster. Mm-hmm. So a curiosity, you think, well, they all have fuel-efficient homes, even the well, not a bit of it. So there's a sort of PRS sector inefficiency of heating and homes issue, which I think goes beyond what most people would normally think. I mean, I was surprised. I suspect others might be as well. That's one point, one end of the scale. At the other end of the scale, I mean, I know this is slightly going beyond the purview of next year's budget, but, when the London plan revision comes to be delivered, it seems to me that's a major opportunity through the London plan to drive environmental improvement in terms of density, the quality of homes and where they're built, public transport interventions, all of which are passed through this sort of logic of what would be better in terms of delivering a target in 2030 and what would be less good. So I think the London plan, when it comes to be revised, could profoundly help.
Absolutely. I've already logged it myself, but I think as a committee we should be logging the London plan as a useful tool on this. Stuart.
I think there's a more general point here that one of the obstacles is that the costs and benefits of action or investment in this area fall with different parties and also fall on different timescales. And this speaks to the point we were talking about earlier, which is the way that public sector budgets are spread between different agencies, and there's real obstacles in working in partnership and collaborating with budgets and doing so over extended periods, and that surely has to be a priority for a future government.
Mm-hmm. And also for a London mayor, because actually the one thing that I think we saw in the budget process last year was that actually this climate budgeting process was actually getting people thinking in a more long-term way and understanding what actually needs to be done to achieve those targets. The only other thing I wanted to raise was the Green Finance Fund, which provides flexible loans with interest rates which are determined on a project-by-project basis, but they don't exceed the Public Works Loan Board rates. And this is green financing sort of coming from the GLA, so using GLA reserves to lend out for green projects. And I just wondered if anyone had any observations or things that they wanted to comment on in relation to that as a measure, whether you think the GLA should be doing more of it or less of it or anything else. Antonia.
I was actually going to come back on a couple of points that have just been made. So sorry, jumping back a few steps. But I guess just the way we're thinking about sort of the retrofit sort of challenge and opportunity at Centre for London is very much as potentially a really significant local economic boost or opportunity. And I think thinking about sort of what Alfie was saying about the supply side, the workforce, I think potentially it should be incumbent on an organisation like the GLA to think with half a mind on that longer term planning about how we can make sure that essentially 16-year-olds in college today are the ones in 10 years' time with their own construction companies delivering these contracts. And I think what's come through in the discussion so far is very much the need for an ecosystem approach. We know that to answer this challenge, we're going to have to bring together colleges, construction companies. We're going to need to, map the size of the prize essentially, and we're probably also going to have to do, talking about reframing narratives, etc. A bit of work with young people about the potential careers kind of on offer in this sector. So, yeah, I just wanted to flag a bit of work that we'd done in this space, just to highlight maybe some of the challenges that we should all be thinking about. At the moment, we know when it comes to skills and retrofit, there's a huge job to be done consolidating the qualifications. At the moment, there's a lot of prerequisites that are needed to get retrofit-specific skills. So, for example, you need to have done, so many years as a plumber or a different tradesperson. And actually, there isn't a distinct retrofit qualification. And Centre for London very much believes there's room for that. Second thing that I just wanted to flag was that we also know that the construction market is relatively buoyant, so there needs to be incentives for those tradespeople to come in and reskill, essentially. I don't think there's much of a draw at the moment for people that could be getting those qualifications, as sort of clunky as they are to get them at the moment. And I think, again, that kind of mapping that size of the prize piece could help with that. And then I think the final point to raise is that we know that lots of smaller construction suppliers, find it very difficult to jump through the hoops of the public procurement process. And so I think there's a lot of scope, as I'm sure we all agree, to make that process a little bit smoother and potentially explore to expedite, those local companies getting those contracts, explore things such as social licenses to operate, as opposed to, for example, not that London-specific national social value frameworks, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Did anyone else? Oh, we've got a hand online, and I'll take Tom online.
Tom first.
And then.
Thanks
Tom.
very much. I mean, the Green Finance Funds, I think, seems like a good initiative and particularly important given the combination of a very ambitious net zero target and only limited direct control of emissions and even public sector emissions within London. I suppose a couple of warnings or things that you might want to be looking out for as the committee would be to ensure that these aren't just the green requirements aren't just sort of tick boxes that projects that would have been perhaps pursued anyway and perhaps would have been funded in other ways, just a way for them to get different funding at a more preferable rate, and that this is genuinely funding the most high impact from a carbon reduction perspective project, and ideally the types of projects that would have struggled to get funded through the ordinary routes for whatever that organisation is. So if it's NHS bodies, for example, perhaps the type of projects that the NHS isn't routinely funding through its capital budget already. I suspect those are already elements of the brief for the finance fund, but I think that's the key, that it's not just sort of a badge that gets added through which an ordinary project can get a better route that's genuinely high impact investment.
Thank you. That's a useful steer for us as we scrutinise the budget process. Judge it.
Thank you very much. Just a brief point. I had a brief look at the outline of what the Green Finance Fund was intending to do, and I think it's intending to lend about £500 million, 500 million over the course of its life, and I think it's just closed the expressions of interest for the first round of applications. I could be wrong, but I think that's what I saw. It would be interesting, possibly for this time next year, take a view as to how do we see that 500 million being spent over time? Is it front-loaded, or is it happening next year or the year after? And having looked at the applications we've had this year, we might have a better idea of how that is going to be spent on what kind of projects the money has been spent on, because there could be a large number of people applying for a very small amount of money, or a small number of people applying for a very large amount of money, and that would give us an idea as to how it might need to be tweaked in order to meet that 500 million. There's very little information at the moment, but broadly I should have started by saying it seems like a very good idea. So obviously it's in early stages, so I think we might want to produce some kind of analysis of what's happened in the first year of its operation for next year.
Again, a really helpful steer. Thank you very much, and we will take note and incorporate. Stuart, you indicated.
I agree with all those points that have been made. For me, I thought this was a very exciting initiative, and precisely the sort of idea that could overcome the problems of costs and benefits and timescales that we were discussing earlier, and both in terms of capital investment and also the day-to-day running of schemes. And the GLA, I think, is one of the very few public sector bodies in the United Kingdom that has the scope and the scale to pull something like this off. And there's a great deal that can be learned in terms of the implementation for other models across the country.
Thank you very much. Is that it, or anyone else? Tony?
With that in mind, I mean, as I understand it, it's lending money to institutions, presumably with a view to the money being repaid, and therefore it is, although it's been done initially with rates set no higher than PWLB rates. If it works, then presumably one would imagine there's a business opportunity here which could be replicated in the private sector. But if it makes money, if it's lending money to institutions to invest in a way that then saves the money after the money or when the money is paid back, I mean, at some level that ought to be replicable in the private sector. But that would mean it has to work absolutely as a business from the beginning, with that in mind. Which I think is slightly to Tom's point.
So again, that takes us back to our scrutiny role. We need to be checking that it works financially, that it stacks up, so that then we can be pressing the mayor to try rolling it out, seeing if he can find other sort of financial institutions or partners to work with.
I mean, if the GLA can make it work, question why wouldn't a building society or a bank be able to do the same thing and make money out of it? I mean, it seems to me, and that would be a sort of discipline on the scheme to ensure it is business-like.
And also kind of shows climate leadership and kind of makes sense of the whole climate budgeting process.
Just a small footnote to that. In the initial stages, the private sector might have a much higher hurdle rate than the GLA. So we may be in a position here to get this thing started.
Exactly.
And once we know how it works, then to hand it over to the private sector. It's not something you may want to do immediately, because the private sector would treat it as something that has too much risk attached to it, typically.
But if the proof of concept can happen within this GLA project, Absolutely. Okay, I think the chair is probably keen that I hand back to him, unless anyone had anything urgent.
I think probably the person with the last section is keener. So we now move to Assembly Member Pigeon, who has a section on economic development.
Lovely, thank you very much. I mean, obviously, business is crucial in London, and the current kind of support system is complex. It's challenging for everyday sort of business owners to get their heads around. What sort of support do you think, particularly for SMEs, is essential to foster a thriving sort of business environment in London and thus help the economy? And I thought I'd go to Alfie first, because you talked about some of this in your opening remarks.
I don't know if I did, actually.
Well, you did. You talked about business and support. You did. Something I read. Well, that's what I wrote down. Maybe I was. Let me have economic
business support.
Let me have a look.
It was down. I don't think.
Did I not write that down? Maybe I've read my lines wrong. Oh, well, never mind. I'm coming to you, Alfie. There you go. I'm throwing it at you. Sorry. Maybe I've muddled my lines. That's good, isn't it?
I mean, I think.
You talked about money.
It's normative determinism.
Yeah, exactly. I think that. I mean, look, from the first problem we've got at the moment is around a suppressed demand across the country in general. Anyway, so businesses are in a a weak demand outlook. We've got at the moment an inflationary pressure, partly as we've got supply falling short, but the long run trajectory for the UK is weak demand, and that's actually depending on how we come out of the cost of living crisis. If people pay down their savings, etc. The big danger is that there isn't just enough people looking to purchase the goods and services that businesses want to provide, and that has all sorts of then ramifications and long-run effects for the point of equilibrium that you settle at in the city. If by definition of pessimism about the future, businesses opt rather than to invest in productivity enhancements, but instead go for more liquid, cheap labour, zero-hour contracts, etc., you'll just see the same business practices repeating themselves. So I think there needs to be an onus on productivity enhancing measures. It comes back to that sort of getting over the hurdle, de-risking, allowing businesses to invest and grow that way through productivity improvements. I think that business rates is a particularly important lever here. It's one of those really intractable problems, and it's very hard to solve just at the GLA level, but you've got this real problem, which is that effectively the structure of the tax works for no one. It doesn't work for local government, doesn't work for businesses, doesn't work for local government as a sector either, for distribution. But something does have to shift on this, and I think the role of London, the role of GLA in that national movement will be really important. There are lots of options on the table. You could split the tax rate between land and property on the land, which would mean you could incentivise investment in property on the land of any size. You could look at trying to exempt new investments from business rates only. But there are different measures for business rates, I think, which could have an impact. Those would probably be some of the reflections I'd share.
Yeah, no, I'd written weakening labour market, hence I thought I should come to you to get sort of a feel around this, because it's economic development. I realised my question was a bit more targeted about business. I hadn't completely muddled my lines here. Jagjit, you want to come in, and you were next on my list, I thought, on this. Thank you.
I'll keep it brief given the time where we are. I'll focus on SMEs rather than economic development per se, but as I'm sure all the committee know, there's been what's called a Macmillan gap since 1930, identified the Macmillan Committee as this shortage of funding available to small and medium-sized enterprises. It's something that's been looked at by successive governments, but the gap still seems to be immutable. It's in place. Now, there are two arguments here. One is that SMEs don't want the finance. They're very happy to be run as small family businesses and don't need extra finance to grow. That's a demand-side story, potentially. Or there's a supply-side story that the financial sector is not in a position through a reduction in relationship management and centralisation of some of their processes, particularly after the financial crisis, that have made it more difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to obtain the finance that they may need. It's often said that the finance is available through venture capital these days or other forms, but there seems to be evidence to suggest that it is difficult for firms to find finance in the way that they may want to grow, particularly if we look around the whole set of small and medium-sized enterprises. And one stylised fact I again had from discussions with some pension fund managers and people in the financial sector is that the fixed cost to transacting. If I'm going to offer a loan to a company, it's just as costly to make a very large loan to a large company as it is to a small company. And if I make it to a small company, I have to monitor that company in quite an extensive way, which then keeps the costs high over the duration of that loan. That then means that these firms cannot get the access to finance that they want at the term that they want, in terms of the tenor, the length of the loan, and at the price that they may need. So it's likely, more likely than not, there is a financial constraint. How the GLA can offset that, I'm not entirely sure, but it's clear that we ought to be thinking about that and potentially working through ways of helping small firms manage their relationship with the financial sector so they can get the funds that they may need.
Yeah, it's that link, isn't it, and liaison rather than the actual.
Yes.
If I just bring Antonia in, I also wanted to put to you, thinking with your hat on, about are there any examples of successful mayoral interventions or initiatives elsewhere that you think could make a difference to London's economy that we should be looking at? I don't know if any of your work has picked up on that wider issue.
Do you mean mayors from across the UK?
Yeah, or internationally. Are there any great...
Yeah.
I mean, I always love to look internationally, to be honest, to see are there any great examples that we could be looking at in London? And through your work that Centre for London would have done, I'm sure, are there any other examples of interventions that could help London's economy that you've seen that you recommended?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So I've talked a bit about the need for the public procurement process to support SMEs, and I think that's kind of underutilised in London. So I think there's a few ways that can happen, particularly kind of off the back of COVID. We're seeing a lot of public buildings massively underutilised, and I know that Andy Burnham has seen the same in Manchester, and he's used some public buildings to start social enterprise hubs or green enterprise zones, that kind of thing. I think that could be explored within London. Sort of more generally, not COVID specific. I mean, the public procurement process can do things such as encourage and facilitate joint bidding between SMEs for public contracts, and conversely lotting contracts as well. We know that SMEs struggle with long-term security and planning, so as much as the public procurement process can kind of can publish as far as possible into the future its pipeline of contracts, I know that obviously will assist, and similarly immediate cash flows concerns kind of dominate a lot of SME worries, and so just quick turnaround of invoices. I know it sounds basic, but can be a massive assistance. The other thing that I know Centre for London has heard a bit from the SME community that it speaks to is kind of nervousness and worries about getting to net zero. And obviously many SMEs do not have in-house capacity for a sustainability team or similar. But I do wonder whether there could be some kind of initiative that buddies up some SMEs with larger companies to help them kind of plan out their roadmap to net zero, and similarly that could be sort of rewarded via social value frameworks that are very bespoke to London, or a social licence to operate or similar. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you. Do any other members of the panel have any thoughts on any particular programmes that could make a difference to London's economy? Stuart?
Back to a theme we discussed earlier, and somewhat controversially perhaps, it seems to me that this area, perhaps more than any other we've discussed in the course of the afternoon, is one that requires careful thinking about the effectiveness and value for money of interventions. It really is openness to exactly what works and how you should approach it, and I think we've seen that from the comments of fellow panel members.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Tony, and I also wanted to particularly ask you, Tony, about London and Partners, because you're probably the person on the panel who knows a bit about them, what your view is on their effectiveness in some of this area around economic development.
I think it'd be unfair if I, as with so many of our observations from over this side of the room this afternoon, observing about the effectiveness of these large organisations operating across the city and beyond is hard. So what I'm about to say isn't really about London and Partners. Suffice to say, I mean, London and Partners, and not to be critical of them, is a city-wide agency, and yet this is explicitly about sort of traditional businesses. And I think my mind's eye in this is immediately comes in on relatively small neighbourhood businesses. Whose life is flexible and not used to dealing with public bureaucracies. So a sort of cultural issue, I would imagine. I'm not saying anything about any particular existing scheme or authority, but I can see that the way in which government works, which is generally and rightly full of due process and stages and applications and all of that, good, is a long way from the relatively freewheeling way that many smaller businesses work. Separate to that is the fact, and it's important, that many small businesses in London today are funded in a completely different way to the way businesses used to be funded. Startups have a completely different way of raising their money. Not all of it from within the UK. It's raised all over the world in some cases, even for small businesses. So I don't think I could comment on London and Partners' capacities to do this, but I think just generally, the way in which small businesses work and the way in which government works are often in quite a separate part of a spectrum. That's all I think I'd say. And it needs to be as user-friendly as humanly possible if it's to be consistent with the culture of setting up a new business.
Great, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I don't know whether you still had a supplementary question on that, Assembly Member Russell, or if not, you can take us on to the next section, which is social services and equity. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, so this is sort of picking up on the kind of rising inequality in London and the desperate plight of so many Londoners existing on very, very low incomes. And so the first question is, what do you think of the Mayor's free school meals programme, and do you support his aim of it becoming permanent? Who wants to jump on that one? Alfie.
I mean, I think it's a good thing, and it should be continued. As of all these things, we've come across these comments before, you have to look at the opportunity cost for any one given programme. I don't think we were equipped with all the information to say, this thing is immeasurably better than any other particular opportunity. But I think taking it at face value, looking at the evidence that we've seen, it's a good thing, and it will be a good thing to continue. I think that, look, I emphasised this in my opening remarks, and Antonia gave some statistics earlier about London and relative poverty rates. If you take a needs-based measure, it's the picture is just as bleak, actually. So we see London has much higher rates of people who are going about essentials than the rest of the country. It's an urban problem in general, but I think if you look at low-income families, poorest 40% of the population, on average about 2/3 are making sacrifices on essentials every month or so. In London, it's almost 80%. And so this is a particularly acute problem. And I think the reason I mention this is because then when you kind of go to, well, okay, what are the sort of the things that have been done to support it? Free school meals, to address it, sorry. Free school meals is a good thing, it's important, but it really feels like a drop in the ocean at the moment compared to the scale of the challenge that is being faced in the city and across the country. So I think that's the thing I struggle with most, is just whatever the size of the public sector institution, being able to leverage enough the scale of the intervention being requisite to the scale of the challenge. I think it's a hard one to turn into a positive, to spin into a positive constructive comment. But I think we have a real challenge in terms of the critical mass of the problem.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying yes, free school meals is a great policy intervention, but it's a tiny drop in the ocean compared to what's actually needed to kind of really make a change. I'm going to bring in the second question and then let everyone tackle both of them. So, Alfie, continuing on, how can the Mayor support people on medium to low incomes in London, and what services or support are appropriate at GLA rather than at a council level? So I'll let you answer that second part of these questions, and then I'll open it up to everyone else.
So in terms of the second part of the question around what's appropriate at GLA versus local authority level, I don't think actually I'm pretty well equipped to know what the answer to that would be in terms of which apparatus. I think that the sorts of measures that I think are going to be really important are around things we've already touched upon. So it's the fares on public transport, access to affordable housing, definitions of housing. I think then how any discretionary funds are targeted that local authorities have in order to back up the income safety net. So the specifications and the regime and the information that's used to target that appropriately, I think is particularly important. But I do think we've talked about a lot of the measures that are particularly important. You know, it is housing, it is transport. I think the only other one I'd mention is around childcare, which is going to become increasingly important for low-earning families. Of course, if the new expansion of free childcare isn't, there's no entitlement for families outside of work, but if you're on low pay, it will become an incredibly important support measure. The big challenge at the moment is whether childcare providers are equipped to deliver the hours that government is now saying they're going to subsidise them at. And that's something where the local authority or the combined authority, GLA, has a really important role in market shaping, ensuring that providers can provide childcare at the right level of quality. They know what that looks like, and they have support to help access the funding from central government to deliver it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't know actually whether this is a GLA, that can sit at GLA or at council level, but presumably at both levels of government, people should be making the effort to check that the providers have got the support they need to be able to deliver what those low-income Londoners need in terms of childcare.
Yeah, and there's a problem of is it available in the right places? When we see a big expansion in free childcare entitlement, that will see demand grow in places where it doesn't currently exist. So the delivery of the accessibility of those hours and where existing group setting childcare providers are currently situated may not be in the places that are about to explode in demand. So only really, somebody with a bit more bird's-eye view can do that analysis and take a look.
That's something we can check is happening. Who wants to come in on this? Okay, so I've got Stuart and then Judge it.
So I think this is another potentially very exciting innovation. I think in terms of broader measures to address socio-economic disadvantage, I would say it represents a good start, and let's not let the good be the enemy of the best. The two things strike me about it in particular. First of all, it clearly comes from a perspective of socio-economic disadvantage, but we know that there's lots of evidence that it results in strong educational improvements as well. So there's more than one way of looking at this, and the second is that there is, of course, an existing mechanism to deliver this, and arguably there are arguments around economies of scale in not having a means-tested approach, but moving to a more universal approach. As regards whether it's the mayor or individual local authorities, I mean, personally, I don't have a strong view either way, but the GLA is an organisation with the scale and the scope to pull this off, if that's a priority. What's more difficult is if you compare the resources to be devoted to this as compared to other potential initiatives, the ones that Alfie was referring to. And I get, once again, those trade-offs are difficult to measure. There is a certain deadweight cost here. There's a subsidy to families that can afford this, and the question is whether that's a penalty that you want to take in the interest of broader equity and advantage in the areas I've mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you. Jajit.
Thank you very much. Just take some context. The crisis that we see in terms of increasing destitution and people unable to meet their bills and the income hit to the bottom deciles is not only something that's happened as a result of COVID and energy costs and food costs. This distributional problem has been revealed by these shocks. It's been a long time in its gestation, driven very much by low wages in low productivity areas, hospitality, retail, and in many, what we discovered after COVID, very key elements of public service, social care, the NHS and nursing. All these were areas in which wages were low, have largely stayed low compared to other wages in the rest of London, and have revealed the problems that we're now talking about. So it's kind of clear that if it's taken such a long time to gestate, the problem also can't be solved with 1 year's intervention on an emergency basis. It has to be something to which there's a commitment over a number of years. There is evidence to suggest that free school meals have been very helpful to people at the bottom of the distribution. Personally, I'm a late comer to the attractiveness of having a good breakfast, but I would also encourage it, if at all possible, to be extended to breakfast. That might help attendance as well at school. I don't know, but that's a sort of suggestion that does occur to me. But clearly, the families in which there are low wages, one of the problems we have is the increasing incidence of what is unfortunately termed the working poor. People who are at work but don't have much disposable income left at the end of the month. And that's because of transport costs and housing costs. And we've talked a lot about transport and housing costs today. And if there's anything we can do to alleviate those, either by increasing participation in the transport system or increasing the supply of housing, that would help the money that people are earning at the bottom of the income distribution, would help that money go further. But that problem, again, cannot be solved with 1 year's intervention. So again, I would encourage a 5 to 6 year horizon. Think about where we want to be by 2030, as we're doing with net zero, and start that journey in next year's budget. So don't make this a set of random observations or interventions that we're making year on year. I think, look, this is something we need to address.
Yep.
And by addressing it, we're going to improve the lot of the people in the bottom 2 decals of the income distribution in a significant manner over that 5 to 6 year period.
Yep. Thank you. I've got Tom online with a hand up.
Thanks. Just building on Alfie's point on free school meals and opportunity costs, I think this is a good example to go back to the point I made in my opening remarks about the importance of having a clear set of priorities and outcomes that we're trying to achieve. It's quite hard, I think, for us to judge sort of in isolation the how good a use of money the free school meals project is without a clear sense of exactly what the Mayor and the GLA are looking to achieve by it. There were certainly good evidence that the policy helps in certain ways. Universal support as opposed to targeted support is inevitably more expensive and means some of the money going to households that don't necessarily need it, which isn't to say the intervention isn't effective. There's a whole bunch of ways in which universality can make these interventions more effective. But I would also point to evidence from the IFS, for example, on how effective breakfast clubs can be, which I think Jadjit was referring to earlier. Actually really good evidence there, possibly slightly stronger than the role of expanding free school meals. But yeah, I think if there were a clearer sort of outcome that this was trying to achieve, it would be easier for us to adjudicate how good a use of money it is. So I suppose that was just make me emphasize the importance of that clear framework of what are these policies trying to achieve. And then to your second, slightly broader question, I do think there's an interesting question here about actually what is the role of the GLA in these kinds of policies. The boroughs are better placed to identify specific instances of hardship and step in with discretionary funding because they're closer to their residents than the GLA inevitably can be. And many policies that are going to make a meaningful difference to alleviating poverty sit as sort of central government levers rather than GLA ones. Now, I suspect that is partly why the free school meals lever is one that was pulled, because it was one at the discretion of the GLA. So it's not clear to me, given the set of sort of responsibilities and roles that the GLA has, exactly what within its purview it can do to alleviate poverty in the short term. But I would then emphasise the role that it can play in some of those longer term projects and longer term policies that Jadjit mentioned. If we're really going to fix some of these problems, it's not sort of 1 year sticking plasters, it's 5-10 year approaches to building a stronger economy and a fairer economy. And interventions on housing, I think in particular, are ones that can't make a difference in 1 year, but over 5 or 10 really can. And given the GLA's remit, others may disagree, but it seems to me that's where it can most profitably focus.
Thank you. Antonia, did you want to come in on this one, or I can pass on? Tony, did you want
7 minutes left in the meeting.
Tony, if you can very briefly.
Very briefly, I mean, just to build on the point that's come out towards the end here, I mean, targeting is everything. The total expenditure of the GLA and the boroughs together, as I was saying earlier, is something like 10% of all public expenditure in London, therefore 5% of GDP. Everything else is pushing the other way to varying degrees. And therefore, against that backdrop, the way resources are used, be it for free school meals or decisions about further education allocations or indeed building new public transport services, all have a bearing, rather as we were discussing with the environment earlier on. So a sort of benefit to cost ratio for all these interventions in relation to this issue seems to me essential.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you in advance for your incredibly brief answers to our final section, for which we have a grand total of about 5 or 6 minutes. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you, Chair. You'll be happy to know I think I'm known for my brevity. So we've had quite a wide-ranging conversation today, and thank you for all your comments. I'm wondering if you could comment specifically on the effectiveness and transparency of the GLA's budget process. And as it's currently run, and how do you think the voice of Londoners could be represented in that process? Tony, you look like you have ideas.
Deep breath. Well, I mean, in fairness to the GLA, here, this process, that, without being over self-aware, this process we're going through today, and you're going through as an Assembly committee, is rather more exploratory than most equivalent budgets of its kind for any combined authority, mayoral authority, or indeed most councils, or indeed national government. The way public spending is divvied up through the supply process at national government level is never discussed, it just happens. So, having said that, the local authority budgeting more generally, like local authority accounting, is it's evolved the way it has, partly because of accounting standards and so on, but it's not designed, and again, I said earlier, I'm not being critical of those who do it, who work very hard on it. It's not designed for people who don't do all of that all their lives fully to understand it. That's all I'd say. So, is there room for improvement? Yes, but there would have to be a very different way of describing what was about to happen in terms of public spending and the way it's presented if a broader public was to be brought in.
I think it's great that you've, in a relatively early stage, established relationships with people. I stand myself apart who really understand London and its problems, and I think that is investing in the future of this process. That's an incredibly healthy thing. In our own work on fiscal councils, nationally and internationally, what we're trying to do is to get fiscal policy makers, which in this case could be the mayor, to get to a stage where he or she is sort of making a clear statement as to where the economy currently is. Think of it as a State of the Economy address or the State of London address, so that we have a clear analysis every year on how we're doing in terms of employment, destitution, income, that how long it takes to get from A to B, so that then provides messages that we can comment on the next year in terms of progress. And alongside that as well, we've generally called, and I'm pleased to see, at least in some degree, the Chancellor having brought that about, is a standing advisory council on economic issues, that the person who's executive can talk to regularly about possible policy intervention. So what we have today is very much a step in the right direction, but there are more things that could be done, I think.
Antonia.
Thank you. Yeah, I do take the previous points about perhaps budget setting not exactly being the appropriate or not needing community consultation to the same degree as other policy interventions, but just to make the case for it through sort of Centre for London work. So we've done a fair amount of it around the climate challenge, and
I think just a couple of things that I would say is that we've found that, unsurprisingly, when engaging with communities, it is the communities that are best placed to find answers. They know their place very well. Moreover, we know, again, with the climate challenge, that we're going to have to tee up behaviour change, and good consultation kind of ahead of a new policy being implemented starts that process, and also it generates buy-in for kind of what's to come as well. So obviously mitigating resistance later down the line. I mean, on the flip side, or other things to consider that I would flag from our experience at Centre for London, is to do it properly. It is expensive and it's long term, but that shouldn't, I don't think, deter from the need to do it. And obviously, I think it goes without saying, but we need to make sure that we are compensating people for their time if asked to engage meaningfully. And moreover, what we found at Centre for London is we are not the people to make to do that consultation directly. So what I'm saying is, essentially, you need to find kind of trusted messengers or people already within those communities that can be your community researchers. I guess what I'm saying is, I don't suggest GLA policy officers go and do it directly. So yeah, I think those are my only comments on kind of good community engagement. But I do appreciate that in the context of budget setting, it's not, perhaps as appropriate as when deciding strategic priorities or similar. Thanks.
And Tom online.
Thanks. I will emphasise again the importance of a good system that links outcomes and outputs and inputs to ensure that the way that budgets are being designed really fits in with priorities. I should emphasise that I do think the GLA has got a pretty good process for this compared to lots of other organisations, but I do think there's an opportunity to make that more streamlined. And I think more transparency, there's quite a lot of transparency, but more clarity around that would itself help with sort of democracy, accountability, and for more Londoners to have an input on it. So I think that aspect is really important. I also think that, as far as possible, the GLA is in this interesting position on lots of policy issues where on a couple it is the sole owner of the issue, but in lots it's reliant on working in partnership with the boroughs or working sort of alongside or with constraints set by central government. And I think in the way that the budget is set and spoken about, particularly in areas like housing and the environment, a clearer statement of what the GLA is trying to do fits in with what other organisations are trying to do as well, would help to ensure that sort of more, particularly with the boroughs, would help to ensure that everyone's sort of moving in the same direction, that there isn't duplication of effort or indeed sort of countervailing forces.
For that. And Chair, I'm just mindful of time. Would you like me to ask the panel to write to us with question 21, or shall I?
That would be an excellent idea.
Okay, I'm going to write to you, or the Chair will write to you, about further information about any additional tools or metrics that you think could help our process. So I'll leave it to the Chair to thank you all for being here. Thank you.
I can see you're eager to come in, but you're so eager that I'm afraid we're 2 minutes past 5 on a meeting that finishes at 5 o'clock. So I think that brings to an end our sort of main business this afternoon. I just want to really, it's written here in my notes, but I particularly want to thank everyone. It's been a really, really interesting meeting. It's an innovation for us as a committee and as an organisation, getting outside people to come in to sort of challenge our groupthink, to bring an outside perspective on a couple of issues. You said, you weren't quite sure, perhaps as familiar with some of the issues as people here are. What you've brought is sort of fresh eyes from outside. It's been really, really valuable. I want to really thank you for your time in coming here, and Tom at home. I know it's been a very valuable experience that I think we'll definitely want to repeat. So with that being said, can I now formally ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Date of next meeting. Next meeting of the committee will be held on the 21st of November at 2023, 10 a.m. here in the chamber in City Hall. I have no urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.